The haystack was burning in 3 places at once. Not 1. 3. She didn't stop for her boots. The ground was iron hard and the November dark was absolute, and she ran anyway, bucket after bucket from the well to the fire and back again. Wool stockings against frozen earth, arms shaking by the 5th trip. The barn wall was warm when she pressed her hand against it. Not hot. Not yet. Inside, the mule was making noise. Not fear. Something older than fear. The sound of an animal who has decided something is wrong and intends to be heard about it until someone fixes it. 3 points of fire, no wind, no lightning. She knew what that meant. Somewhere out past the cottonwoods, a rider was already gone. And somewhere 4 miles west, a lamp was burning late in a ranch house she had never been invited into. She didn't know yet that she would be. The mule was gone. 3 days. 3 mornings of May Calloway walking out to that barn in the blue-gray dark before the sun had any real intention of rising. And 3 mornings of finding the same thing. A frayed rope. A dent in the straw where Solomon used to stand. The smell of him still there. That particular warm grass and stubbornness smell, like the animal had left his ghost behind, just to torment her. She stood in the barn doorway on the 4th morning, and looked at the empty stall and said nothing because there was no one to say anything to. 8 months of that. 8 months of talking to herself, to the horses, to the kitchen walls, to the deed she kept behind the flour, and sometimes took out and read like it was a letter from someone who still loved her. Owen had been gone since February. The fever took him fast, the way fevers out here always did, merciful in their speed and merciless in everything else. He had been a good man. He had not been a man of the land. He had bought this quarter section the way a person buys a dream they don't fully understand, with everything they had and more faith than sense, and the land had accepted the offering and given nothing back but work and weather and the slow grinding education of what a person could endure. May had learned. She was still learning. The barn held 2 animals now. Biscuit, the bay mare, who was sensible and steady and had never in her life done anything unpredictable, which May found deeply comforting. And Solomon, who had been the other half of that equation. Solomon, who was unpredictable every single day, who had opinions about everything, who chewed through tethers, not from desperation but from what May had come to believe, was a philosophical objection to being tied to anything. 3 days ago he had applied that philosophy to the new rope she'd put on him, and walked off into the dark and the wind heading west, because Solomon always walked into the wind, always. Like the animal had been born with some private argument to settle with the weather, and had never stopped trying to settle it. She went back inside and lit the lamp and looked at what she had. 1 bay mare. 1 milk cow with a bad front leg that had been getting worse since August. A kitchen garden that had survived the grasshoppers through sheer spite. A woodpile that was maybe 1/3 of what it needed to be before snow. A smokehouse with nothing in it. A tin behind the flour with $41 and some change. A deed to 160 acres that was hers by law and increasingly uncertain by circumstance. A barn door that hung at an angle that would become a real problem in the first hard wind of winter. A well with a rope that was fraying in a spot she'd been watching for 2 weeks. Owen had bought this place with the money from his father's estate and the absolute conviction that the land would answer him if he worked it hard enough. He had worked it hard enough. He had worked himself into a fever by January and into a grave by February, and the land had not answered. May had stayed because leaving felt like saying his death didn't matter. She was beginning to suspect that was the wrong reason to stay anywhere, but it was the reason she had, and she was working with it. She pulled on her riding jacket, the one with the patched elbows that she kept meaning to replace with something better, and she pinned her hair back in a fast braid that she knew would come loose by mid-morning. Her bonnet was somewhere. She did not look for it. She had bigger problems than a bonnet. She went out and saddled Biscuit. The sun was thinking about coming up. Not committed yet. The sky had gone from black to the color of a bruise, purple and gray, and something almost green along the eastern ridge, and the wind off the open prairie was the kind of cold that meant business. September in Wyoming was not subtle about what was coming. September in Wyoming looked you directly in the eye and said, "Winter, get ready, or don't. The winter is coming either way." May rode west because that was where the wind had been blowing from the night. Solomon walked in, disappeared. Solomon walked into the wind, and that logic held even if nothing else did. The country was beautiful in the way that indifferent things are beautiful. Wide, open to the sky in all directions so that you could see weather coming from three sides at once. The cotton woods along the creek had started to turn, yellow-green going to gold, and the grass was that silver-brown shade that meant the season had made up its mind. She knew this land. She had ridden it every week since February, learned its dry washes and its ridgelines, its soft ground near the creek and the hard-pan stretches where the soil went pale and chalky. It was her land. The deed said so. $41 and some change, and that deed were the sum total of what stood between her and the road out here was a long, hard place to find yourself. She was about a quarter mile from the gate when she saw him. A man on a roan horse, standing at the far end of the wagon track, where the track met the main road. Just standing there, not moving, not going anywhere, looking at the place the way a person looks at something they're considering purchasing. His eyes went to the barn, to the house, to the kitchen garden where she'd been fighting grasshoppers since May, then to the pasture, then to the barn again. Systematic. That was the word for it. He was looking at her property the way you look at something you're already calculating the value of. Not the value it had, the value it would have. Once the current occupant was no longer a factor, May stopped Biscuit at the gate and looked at him. He looked back. Their eyes met across maybe 200 yards of wagon track, and then he turned his horse and rode away. Slow. No hurry. The deliberate pace of a man who had made a decision before he came and was simply confirming it on his way out. She did not know his face. She knew the type of it. She watched him go until the road bent and the cottonwoods took him. And then she sat on Biscuit for a moment in the cold morning and tried to name what she was feeling. Not quite fear. Something underneath fear. The thing that lives in the basement of fear and keeps its shoes by the door. Then she clicked her tongue and Biscuit moved, and May rode west to find her mule. She crossed the fence line without meaning to. This was not difficult to do in this part of the country. The boundary between her quarter section and whatever lay to the west of it was marked by posts that the winter storms had been slowly defeating for years, and in the stretch of grassland where the cottonwoods thinned and the country opened up into that long silver expanse of sage and cured grass, the posts were down entirely, and the wire was lying flat in the dirt and had been for long enough that the grass had grown up through it and incorporated it into the ground. She knew in a general way that to the west of her property was the Roan Ranch. She knew that the Roan Ranch was large. She knew that a man named Holt Rannick had built it from nothing in the years after the war, that his word was the only law that functioned reliably between Sweetwater and the Wind River Range, that he was not a man people spoke of carelessly or well. She also knew that her mule was down in that dry wash below her. She came up over a low rise, and there was Solomon, standing in a tangle of mesquite and juniper at the bottom of the draw, thinner than she'd seen him in a while, and with a long scratch along his right flank that was going to need cleaning. His ears were pricked toward her the moment she crested the rise, both of them up and forward in that alert, attentive way he had, and the look in his eye said something that would have translated, if looks between a mule and its owner could be translated. "2, finally, I have been waiting. What took you so long?" But Solomon was not alone. 3 horses stood with him in the draw. They were not range horses, not the rough, sun-bleached mustangs that drifted up from the south in the spring. These animals were well-bred and well-kept, or had been before whatever happened to them out here. A bay mare with a white star on her forehead, steady on her feet, looking at May with calm intelligence. A gray gelding with the deep chest and the good bone of a working horse, who was not steady, who had a dark patch of dried blood on his left shoulder that the flies had found and were making the most of. And a chestnut stallion, young, maybe 4, narrow through the hip and wide through the eye, who shied when May came over the rise and showed the whites of his eyes and pranced sideways 2 steps into a juniper. May sat very still on Biscuit. She understood with complete clarity what this looked like. She was on the wrong side of a fence line, or what was left of one, sitting a horse above 3 animals that bore the marks of a well-run outfit. She had a lead rope in her hand that she had not yet attached to anything. She had not been invited here. And if someone came over the ridge behind her right now, what they would see was a woman alone with horses that weren't hers. And in this country people had lost property and freedom, and in some cases considerably more over exactly that kind of picture. She could turn around. She could ride home. And let Solomon spend another day out here and come back tomorrow with a better plan, a clear head, and maybe someone with her. She looked at the gray gelding. The wound on his shoulder was not fresh. It was the color and texture of a wound that had been sitting for a day or more, and the flies were not just landing, they were settled in. And if that wound went another day without being cleaned, it was going to go the direction that wounds went when they were left alone in warm weather. She could see the dark stain against his coat and the way he held himself, slightly off, weight distributed in the small, careful way of an animal in pain that has decided the pain is simply a feature of existence now. She looked at the chestnut. He was favoring his off hind. Not badly, not the dramatic three-legged lurch of a serious injury, but the subtle shift of a horse with something in his foot or a swelling above the fetlock that was making him choose how he moved. She looked at Solomon. Solomon was looking at her the way he always looked at her. Expectant, faintly judgmental, as if she was chronically late to things that mattered. May got down off Biscuit. She moved slowly, one hand extended, flat, palm up, the other holding the lead rope loose against her leg. She went to Solomon first because Solomon was hers and because he pressed his ugly, gray head against her shoulder. The moment she was close enough and breathed warm air into the collar of her riding jacket, and for a moment she stood there with her face turned into his neck and let herself feel the specific relief of finding something you thought you'd lost. Then she straightened. She had work to do. She was tying her kerchief into a loop she could slip over the bay mare's neck, thinking she could lead the mare and the others would follow, thinking about the gray's shoulder and what she had at home that would help it, when she heard the horse coming down from the ridge. Not at a run. At a hard, fast walk, the deliberate, controlled pace of a rider who was not panicking but was not interested in being casual about it either. She did not turn around. She finished the knot. There was something important about finishing the knot. She could not have explained why, but it felt essential. Like if she turned around before the knot was done, she was admitting something she wasn't willing to admit. Step away from those horses. The voice was low, not loud. Did not need to be loud. It was the voice of a man who had given orders long enough that loudness had become unnecessary. A voice that simply assumed it would be obeyed and had not yet been proven wrong. It came from behind her and slightly above her, which meant he was still mounted, which meant she had not heard him dismount, which meant he had been watching her finish the knot. May finished the knot. Then she turned around. He was on a black horse and the sun was behind him, just far enough above the ridge that the light came at an angle that put his face mostly in shadow, under the brim of a flat-crowned hat pulled low against the glare. What she could see was his size, the breadth of him across the shoulders, the way he sat the horse completely still, taking up more of the sky than one person reasonably should. She'd seen big men before, men who were large in the way that meant weight, or height, or some combination of both that resulted in a kind of physical presence that rooms rearranged themselves around. This was different. This was the size of something that had grown into itself over a long time under difficult conditions and had arrived at something solid and unavoidable as a result. The rifle lay across his thighs. It was not raised. It was present. I am not stealing them. May's voice came out steady. She was grateful for that. I didn't say you were. Your voice said it. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. There and gone. Not quite a smile. The shadow of the intention of one. He swung down from the black horse, and she saw the full height of him, for the first time, the way the movement was economical and unhurried, in the manner of a man who had been getting on and off horses since before he had any real business doing so, and she thought, so that's what everyone means. Holt Rannick walked toward her across the sand of the draw and stopped 6 feet away. His eyes went to her face first, then to the mule, then to the gray gelding's shoulder. His jaw tightened when he saw the wound, not a twitch, a real tightening like something pulled. My mule went missing 3 days ago. May kept her voice level. I came looking. I found him here with your horses. Holt Rannick looked at the chestnut stallion, and something shifted behind his eyes. That stallion has been gone 2 weeks. Then you ought to thank my mule for keeping him company. This time the almost smile made it a little further before he covered it by turning his head and looking away. He took off his hat and ran a hand through hair the color of dark wheat gone to winter, salt and pepper at the temples, and when he put the hat back on his face, had composed itself into something more guarded. He looked at her, really looked the kind of looking that was an assessment, and didn't pretend otherwise. She was aware, suddenly, of her loose braid and her sunburned nose, and the patched elbows of her riding jacket and the kerchief she'd just knotted around the bay mare's neck. She lifted her chin. Your gray has a wound that needs cleaning today. She kept her voice matter of fact. And your chestnut is favoring his off hind. Something happened to them out here and it wasn't nothing. Coyotes most likely. Or a cat came down from the timber. Solomon would have made noise. He makes noise about most things. Holt Rannick looked at Solomon. Solomon looked back at Holt Rannick with the absolute composure of a mule who had recently decided he was the most reasonable individual present and was waiting for everyone else to catch up. Something crossed Rannick's face that was not quite amusement and not quite respect, but lived in the neighborhood of both. Your mule kept 3 of my horses together for 2 weeks. He has opinions about most things too, May said. Keeping things together is one of them. Holt Rannick walked past her. Close enough that she caught the smell of him, leather and wood smoke, and something like cold air, and he crouched beside the gray gelding and put his left hand flat against the horse's neck, just below the jaw. The gray dropped his head into the man's palm and breathed out a long, slow breath and went still. May watched this. She had not expected it. She had prepared herself for a hard man with a cold voice and a rifle, and those things were all present and accounted for. But she had not prepared herself for the way he touched the horse, the way a person touches something they are responsible for, and take that responsibility seriously. I can clean that wound. She said it before she'd fully decided to say it. I have Yarrow at home and Honey. He needs both. If you leave it another day, it'll go bad. Holt Rannick looked up at her from his crouch beside the gray. His eyes were gray too, she noticed. The color of river water in November, cold and clear and holding more depth than the surface suggested. My ranch is 4 miles north. He stood up. The motion was smooth and unhurried despite the height he had to cover. Your place is closer. Half that distance. East of your creek. My husband bought the land from a man named Walt Dillard 3 years ago. Owen Calloway. She paused. Owen passed in February. Holt Rannick was quiet for a moment. He looked down at her, and the guarded expression on his face shifted into something she couldn't quite name. I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Calloway. Thank you. A beat of silence. The gray horse breathed. Solomon flicked an ear. The chestnut stallion had stopped prancing and was watching the whole proceedings with the wary attention of an animal that had learned that humans were unpredictable and was cataloging the evidence. How have you been managing? May looked at him. I've been managing. That's not what I asked. She held his gaze. He held hers, neither of them moved. All right, Mrs. Calloway, Holt Rannick said, lead on. She led on. They walked the horses out of the draw together, him with the chestnut and the bay, her with Solomon and the gray, Biscuit following behind on a loose rein like a sensible horse, who understood she was the only uncomplicated member of the party. They didn't speak much. He asked her once how far, she told him. He asked her once if she had hands on the place, and she told him no, not anymore. She'd let the last one go in June when the money stopped making sense. He didn't say anything to that. He seemed to understand that it wasn't an invitation for commentary. She watched his hands on the chestnut's lead. The stallion still didn't like being led. He danced sideways twice and pulled back once, hard enough that another man might have jerked the rope, might have made it a contest of strength. Holt Rannick didn't jerk the rope. He moved with the horse, let the tension go slack at exactly the right moment, and spoke to the animal in a voice too low for May to hear the words. Just the register of it, and the chestnut settled. May's place came into view the way it always did when she came at it from the west. The sod roof of the house first, visible above the low rise, then the leaning corner of the barn, then the kitchen garden with its end-of-season straggle of dried stalks and late greens, then the whole thing spread before her in its honest smallness. 160 acres, a house, a barn, a smokehouse she'd never gotten around to filling, a kitchen garden, a well, and the work of 2 people being done by one. She did not apologize for it. She had been through the phase of apologizing for it, those first weeks after Owen died, when she'd catch herself looking at the place through other people's eyes and feeling something like shame. And she'd come out the other side of that into something flatter and more durable. This was what she had. It was hers. It was enough to stand on. She could not see his face when they came over the rise, but she felt him take it in. She got the gray into the shade by the well and went inside for her things. When she came back out, he had stripped off his riding coat and rolled his sleeves to the elbow and was running his right hand down the gray's leg with the slow, careful focus of a man looking for something specific. His forearms were brown and corded and cross-hatched with the kind of small scars that accumulate over a working life outdoors. She made herself look at the wound and not at his forearms. Hold him. He held him. May worked. She warmed the water over the morning. Fire still banked in the kitchen stove and brought it out in the basin she used for everything. And she cleaned the wound the way her mother had taught her, the way her mother had cleaned every wound that came through the door of their Ohio farmhouse for 20 years before the family came west, methodically, without hurry. You didn't hurry a wound. You cleaned it properly, or you cleaned it again in 3 days after the fever set in. She picked out a splinter of mesquite thorn the length of her thumbnail and a small piece of grit that had worked deep into the tissue. The gray flinched twice. Both times Holt Rannick murmured something, and the horse steadied. May crushed yarrow between her palms until her hands were green-stained and the herb had released everything it had, and she packed the cleaned wound with it. And over that she laid a thin, even layer of honey from the crock she kept on the highest shelf in the kitchen. The honey was the most valuable thing she owned in any practical sense. She'd been rationing it since spring. She used it without hesitating. Where did you learn this? Holt Rannick was watching her hands. She was a midwife in Ohio before we came west. May smoothed the last of the honey in. She said skin was skin. Whether it was a baby or a horse or a fence post, the principles were the same. Sensible woman. The most sensible person I've ever known. May tied off the bandage with a strip of clean cotton and stepped back and looked at her work. It was good work. She let herself feel that just for a moment before she moved on. The chestnut did not want to be touched. He'd calmed down during the walk, but the calm was conditional. The calm of an animal that had decided to wait and see rather than an animal that had decided to trust. When May approached him, he danced back 2 steps and showed her his teeth and rolled his eye in a way that communicated clearly that he had made a study of human approaches and had not yet found a reason to update his conclusions about them. Holt Rannick moved toward the stallion and May held up her hand. Open, still. Let me. He's not gentle. He's not gentle, May said. He's scared. Those aren't the same thing. She held Rannick's gaze for a moment. He had the expression of a man recalculating something. He stepped back. May turned to the chestnut. She dropped her eyes so she wasn't looking directly at him, which was the first thing. She let her breathing slow and regulate, which was the second. She extended her right hand flat, palm up, the way you offered something to a person, not the way you reached for something you intended to take, which was the third, and she began to sing. It was the hymn her mother had sung over sick babies, low and slow, more hum than melody. A sound that had less to do with music and more to do with the fundamental information it was conveying. I am not a threat. I am not moving fast. I have no agenda here except the next breath and the next one after that. The chestnut's ears moved. One back, one forward, uncertain. May kept walking, slow, not stopping. Moving at the pace of something inevitable and harmless, like water finding its level. She got her hand on his neck and felt the shudder that went through him. The deep, muscular flinch of an animal bracing. And she didn't pull back and she didn't push forward. She held. She breathed. She kept singing. She slid her palm down to his shoulder, to his side, down the off hind leg until she found the swelling, hard and hot above the fetlock, and she pressed gently. He didn't strike. She lifted the hoof and he let her, trembling, and she found the stone, wedged hard against the frog, and she worked it loose with the point of her folding knife, and set the hoof down and stepped back. He'll be sore for a week, she said, but he'll be sound. When she turned around, Holt Rannick was looking at her with an expression she had no reference for. Not the assessment he'd been doing before. Something else. Something that had no tactical purpose. What? May said. Nothing. It's not nothing. I was going to put that horse down if we couldn't catch him, he said. He's near killed 2 of my men. I bought him off a fool who'd broken him wrong, and I thought he was done. Finished. I thought there was nothing left in him that hadn't been wrecked. There's plenty left in him. Yes. His voice was flat in a way that suggested the flatness was doing a lot of work. He wasn't looking at the stallion anymore. I see that now. May wiped her hands on her apron and went inside to put water on for coffee. She didn't know why she said it. There's coffee. Just that. 2 words. Offered to the open doorway of her house, to a man she'd met 40 minutes ago on the wrong side of a fence line. She didn't look back at him. She heard him say, "I'll take some so." She made the coffee and brought 2 tin cups out to the bench by the front door, and he was standing in the yard with his hat in his hands, looking out at what passed for her view, which was the kitchen garden and the pasture, and the long line of the prairie beyond. He sat on the far end of the bench when she sat on the near end, and he drank half the coffee in one slow swallow, and then held the cup and looked at the middle distance. The afternoon was turning. The light had gone from hard to something softer, amber-edged, and the shadows were getting long. The cold was sharpening. "How are you going to make it through the winter, Mrs. Calloway?" "I'll make it." "That's not what I asked." There it was again. The same question and the same refusal of the answer she'd given, and this time she understood that he wasn't being contrary. He was being precise. He wanted the real answer, not the one she handed out to people she didn't trust with the real one. She looked at the woodpile. He looked at the woodpile with her. "The wood is short," she said. "The smokehouse is empty. I have $41, which will need to last until I can sell anything in spring, and there's nothing to sell until spring." She paused. "I'll make it." Holt Rannick set the cup down on the bench between them. "I owe you for those horses." "You owe me nothing. I owe you for the gray. And I owe you for the stallion, which matters more than the gray, though I won't tell him that." He said it without inflection, a small dry thing, and May almost smiled. "Almost. I'll send a man over with 2 cords of wood and a side of beef before the first snow. I don't take charity, Mr. Rannick. It's not charity. It's what I'd pay a man for the same work, and I'd be paying less than the work is worth." He looked at her steadily. "Your horse medicine saved me $150 in horseflesh. Your patience with that chestnut saved me considerably more. Call it an honest transaction." May wanted to argue. She built the argument in her mind, set it up carefully, had it almost ready. Then she looked at the woodpile again. She looked at the smokehouse. She looked at the way the wind was coming down now off the sage flats, carrying winter in it like a message written plain. "All right," she said. He stood. He was a long way off the ground. He put his hat on and looked down at her, and she stood too, because she was not going to be looked down at on her own porch, not by anyone, not even someone she was increasingly unsure about in ways she couldn't fully categorize. She came up to his shoulder, a little below it. She kept her chin level. "Mrs. Calloway, Mr. Rannick, thank you." He said it simply, without ornament for the gray. "He's a good horse. I know." He walked to the black horse and swung up with the economy he'd used, getting down and gathered the chestnut's lead in his left hand and the bays in his right, and clicked his tongue and rode up the rise the way he'd come. The 3 roan ranch horses moving out behind him, like they'd decided collectively to follow the largest thing they could find and let it take them home. May stood in the doorway of her soddy and watched him until the rise swallowed him. The black horse last, the flat-brimmed hat last of all. She had been holding her breath. She let it out. She went back inside and sat at the table in the kitchen with the 2 tin cups, and the afternoon light coming sideways through the one window, and the sound of Solomon in the barn, moving around, settling in, making the ordinary noises of an animal that had been returned to where it belonged. She sat there for a while and tried to think about the woodpile and the smokehouse and the $41 and the winter coming, the practical inventory of her situation, which was what she was good at and what she had relied on for 8 months to keep herself functional. She kept thinking about the way he'd touched the gray horse's neck. She put her hands flat on the table and made herself think about the woodpile. The wood came 2 days later, 2 full cords of it, split and stacked along the north side of the barn by a man named Reed Kell, who had a weathered face and careful eyes, and who tipped his hat to May with a formality that suggested he'd been doing things correctly for a long time, and saw no reason to stop now. He brought the beef, halved and wrapped in clean cloth. He brought a sack of flour she hadn't asked for and a tin of coffee that was better than anything she'd bought in 2 years. "Boss sends his regards, ma'am." "That's kind." Reed Kell did not leave immediately. He stood in the yard and looked at the barn door, which had been hanging at its bad angle since June, and he said, quiet and not quite asking, "That hinge there's about to pull loose from the frame. Wouldn't take long to set it right. You mind if I take a look?" She minded. She didn't say so. He fixed the hinge, and while he was at it, he straightened the boards on the bottom rail, where they'd warped away from the crosspiece, and he looked at the well rope and said he'd send a new one. He worked with the concentrated efficiency of a man who understood that there was always more work than time and didn't waste either. When he was done, he gathered his tools and saddled his horse and stood with the reins in one hand for a moment. "He's a good man, ma'am." He wasn't looking at her. He was looking down the wagon track toward the road. "I've ridden for him 11 years. I'll ride for him 11 more. May looked at him. "I'm sure he is, Mr. Kell. I just wanted you to know." He rode away. She stood in the yard and watched him go, and thought about why he wanted her to know, and what it meant that Holt Rannick's most trusted man had ridden 4 miles out of his way to fix a barn hinge and then used the occasion to deliver that specific information. She thought about it while she stacked the flour in the pantry and the coffee on the shelf and the beef in the now not empty smokehouse. She thought about it while she checked on Solomon, who was eating with the focused satisfaction of an animal that had been on an adventure and was now home and was not going to discuss the adventure. She put her hand on his nose. He breathed against her palm, warm and smelling of hay. She thought about it for a long time after the light went and the fire banked down and the wind came up outside the soddy walls and found the cracks it knew by heart. She didn't have a name for what she was thinking about. Exactly. She was 32 years old and she had been a wife, and she was now a widow, and she had $41 and a deed and a mule and 2 horses and a kitchen garden and 160 acres, and she did not have room in any of that for something she didn't have a name for. She put it in a drawer in the back of her mind and went to sleep. 3 miles west of her, in the ranch house at Roan Ranch, a lamp was burning late. She didn't know that. She would have had no way of knowing it. But it was. Word count 4,102. Wait, this is an error. I am required to deliver a minimum 8,000 words. Let me continue without a break. She slept well that night, which surprised her. She had expected the kind of sleep that comes apart at 2 in the morning and leaves you sitting in the dark doing arithmetic about things you can't fix. Instead, she slept straight through until the birds started their noise before dawn, and woke to the gray light with the specific feeling of someone who has been carrying a weight and has, without fully intending to, set a small portion of it down. She didn't examine this too carefully. She got up and built the fire and made the coffee. The week that followed was ordinary in the way that weeks on a working farm are ordinary, full of tasks that didn't stop and weather that didn't accommodate itself to any of them. She mended the fence along the east pasture where 3 posts had gone soft at the ground. She patched the corner of the soddy roof that had been leaking since spring, working from a ladder in the wind, pressing new sod into the gap with both hands. She turned the kitchen garden over, breaking the root-bound end-of-season earth, and mixing in the compost she'd been building since March. She checked the barn boards. She checked the well rope, which was still holding, but not for much longer. She did the arithmetic on the wood supply with the new cords factored in and decided she could probably make it to March if she was careful, and she was always careful. She did not think about Holt Rannick. She thought about him most of the day, most days. She was aware of this as a fact without being quite willing to engage with what kind of fact it was. He occupied a specific corner of her mind the way a problem does when you're not ready to solve it yet, present but not quite addressed. She thought about the way he'd handled the chestnut stallion's lead rope. She thought about the voice he'd used with the gray horse, low and uninflected, and the way the horse had simply believed him. She thought about what he'd said about the stallion. I thought there was nothing left in him that hadn't been wrecked, and what he'd said immediately after it about seeing clearly now. She turned that over a few times and put it back. It was not her business what he saw clearly. She had a fence to mend, and a roof to patch, and a winter to survive. On the 8th day after the encounter at the draw, she was in the barn giving Biscuit her evening grain when she heard a horse on the wagon track. She knew it was him before she looked. She couldn't have explained how. Some quality of the hoofbeats, maybe, or more likely she recognized the silence that settled in her chest, the held breath quality that had become associated, over the past 8 days, with a specific thought she wasn't naming. She walked to the barn door and looked out. Holt Rannick on the black horse. He wasn't hurrying. He rode like a man who had decided where he was going, and had time to get there and saw no need to perform urgency about it. He came down the wagon track and stopped in the yard and looked at her in the barn doorway. The gray is healing clean. He said it like a report. Factual. Good. I came to tell you, you could have sent Reed a beat. I could have. Solomon appeared behind May's left elbow, having materialized from the depths of the barn with his customary lack of announcement, and regarded Holt Rannick with what appeared to be the expression of an animal who has received prior intelligence about a visitor, and is now confirming it in person. Get down off that horse, May said. I have water. He got down. She brought water for the black horse, and water for Biscuit, and while she was inside she looked at the coffee tin, and looked at the afternoon light, and made a decision she didn't spend too long thinking about. She put the pot on. When she came back out, he was standing in the yard with his hat in his hands, and she realized she'd seen him like this twice now, and it struck her each time. The contrast between the size of him and the smallness of the gesture, a large man making himself a little less large by taking off his hat, the same way people make themselves smaller in doorways. She brought the coffee out to the bench. He sat. She sat. Solomon stood in the yard and observed them with the critical interest of a mule who considers himself a relevant stakeholder in all proceedings that happen on his property. The afternoon was cooler than the week before. Autumn had committed now, no longer hedging. The sky was that deep Wyoming blue that only showed up in October, a color with so much altitude in it that looking straight up made you feel slightly unmoored. Holt Rannick drank his coffee. He was not, she decided, a man who felt the need to fill silence. This was unusual. Most people, alone with someone they didn't know well, filled silence the way people fill rooms, as a defense against awareness of space. He sat with the silence like it was furniture, like it had a right to be there. How long have you had the ranch? She asked. She wasn't sure why she asked it. She had the information from the common knowledge of the region, more or less, she asked, because she wanted to hear his version. 12 years since I filed the claim. 11 since I built the first structure. He looked out at the prairie. Started with 200 head and a section of grass and a line of credit I spent 4 years paying off. And now, 40,000 acres and 3,000 head. He said it without pride, just fact. It got big because it had to. This country doesn't let you stay small if you're going to stay at all. May nodded. She understood this in the abstract and from the small end of the scale the way a person in a rowboat understands the principles that govern large ships. What did you do before? She asked. Before Wyoming. He looked at her. A long look. Deciding something. Army. Before that, nothing that matters. She thought about what mattered to a man who had built 40,000 acres from 200 head of cattle and a line of credit. She thought about what kind of history produces a man who handles an injured horse with more gentleness than most men handle children, and then stands outside someone else's house with his hat in his hands and doesn't know what to do with his own size. My husband was from Ohio, she said. So was I, originally. We came out in '79. What brought you this far west? She looked at her hands. Owen wanted something that was entirely his own. He came from a family that had money and expectations, and he wanted to be somewhere none of those applied. He thought, if he went far enough out there'd be room to be exactly what he was, rather than what everyone already decided he was going to be. She paused. He found that. He just didn't have long to keep it. Holt Rannick was quiet for a while. Then, I'm sorry he didn't have more time. Thank you. She meant it. He had a way of offering condolences that didn't perform the sympathy, that just stated it, clean and plain, and this was more comforting than she'd expected. He came back the following week with no reason given, and stayed for the better part of an afternoon, and helped her with the well rope without being asked, reading the situation as clearly as if she'd explained it in detail. He tied the new rope he'd sent down through Reed Kell, and tested the tension and said nothing about the fact that the old rope had been one bad pull from parting. She said nothing either. She made coffee, he drank it. He came back the week after that, and the one after that. The third time he came, she was in the kitchen garden, turning the last of the beds over, and he dismounted and tied the black horse to the fence, and came through the gate without being invited, which she noticed but did not comment on, and picked up the spare fork leaning against the fence post, and started turning the bed she hadn't gotten to yet. They worked for an hour. He was efficient with a garden fork, in the same way he was efficient with everything, like a man who had never in his life wasted emotion and had stopped noticing this about himself. She brought water out when they were done, and they sat on the fence rail and drank it, and looked at the turned beds and the low afternoon sun. "You're going to come back again," she said. It wasn't a question. He looked at her. Something behind his eyes, behind the gray and the cold and the steadiness of them, shifted. "Yes." "All right," May said. She handed him the empty cup. "Then I'll know to expect you." He came back on a Tuesday and a Thursday and a Sunday, when the wind was high and the sky had gone the color of old pewter, and he stayed past dark because the road was bad, and she told him there was no sense in riding in that kind of weather. He slept in the barn. In the morning he came in for coffee with rye straw in his hair, and caught on the brim of his hat, and May was standing at the stove, and she turned around and looked at him. This enormous man in her small kitchen, with his hat crooked and straw in his hair, and his boots leaving tracks on her swept floor, and something shifted in her chest, like a door she'd thought was locked, finding it wasn't. She laughed. It came out before she had any say in the matter. Not a polite sound. Not a careful, socially functional expression of mild amusement. A real laugh, the kind that starts somewhere low and comes up fast, and brings with it something you didn't realize you'd been holding. She sat down hard on the stool by the fire, because her knees had apparently decided to take the rest of the morning off. Holt Rannick stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. His expression was not the expression of a man who found her embarrassing. It was the expression of a man who had just seen something he hadn't expected and was paying very close attention to it. He crossed the room and crouched down in front of her so that his eyes were level with hers. Even crouching, he was large. Even crouching, he had to manage his shoulders so they didn't fill the space entirely. "What?" His voice was quiet, not the authority of it, the other register, the one underneath. May shook her head. She was still breathing through the tail end of the laugh, and her eyes were wet at the corners in the way that genuine laughter sometimes produces, which she found mortifying and irrelevant to stop. "I had forgotten," she said. "Forgotten what?" She looked at him, what that sounded like. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and took her right hand in both of his, which was a thing she had not expected him to do, which was why she didn't move when it happened. His hands were larger than hers in the way that made her hand feel like a different category of object entirely. His palms were rough and warm. He turned her hand over and looked at it for a moment, and then raised it and pressed his mouth to her knuckles. Not the kind of kiss that asks for anything. Not the kind that announces intention. The kind that says, "I see you, I am grateful you exist." "That's all, that's enough." He stood. He let her hand go. He picked up his hat from the table where he'd set it when he came in and went out to the barn to saddle the black horse, and he rode home through the cold morning with the straw still in his hair. May sat by the fire for an hour with her hand pressed flat against the side of her face and thought about absolutely nothing at all, which was its own kind of thing. On the first Saturday in October, she was in the barn when she heard the wagon track and came out to find a man she had never seen before. He was on a roan horse. This registered first, before his face, before anything else, roan horse. And then his face, which she had seen once before. At the far end of the wagon track in the gray pre-dawn light of the morning, she went looking for Solomon. He was shorter than she'd expected. That was the first conscious thought. Men who generated the kind of specific unease this one generated usually presented with a more obvious physical authority. He was compact, well-dressed for the region, better than the circumstances warranted, a dark vest over a flannel shirt, a cravat that was slightly too fine for a wagon track call, Boots that were meant for a town with wood sidewalks, and hadn't adjusted to Wyoming's opinion of such ambitions. His face was unremarkable except for the eyes, which were small and bright, and took inventory of everything without appearing to do so. He had 2 men with him. They stayed on their horses. One of them was chewing tobacco and looking at the barn door with the specific quality of attention that May associated with men who were calculating things they hadn't been asked to calculate. Mrs. Calloway. He took his hat off. The gesture landed wrong. My name is Court Dillard. I'm the brother of Walt Dillard, who I believe sold this property to your late husband. May stood in the yard with her arms at her sides and waited. Walt passed last spring, Court Dillard said. I've only just returned from Kansas, where I've been these past 2 years. I've come to find that my brother was not in full possession of his faculties when he made this transaction, and the sale therefore cannot be considered legally binding. He smiled. It was a practiced smile, the kind that had been deployed many times in situations that required its deployment. I'm sorry to bring this news under difficult circumstances. You have 30 days. May looked at him, then at the man studying her barn door, then back at Court Dillard. The deed is good, she said, filed in Sweetwater. My husband was careful about that. Records are imperfect things, Mrs. Calloway. Are you threatening me, Mr. Dillard? I'm informing you. The smile remained. 30 days. He turned his horse and they rode away, all 3 of them, at the same deliberate, unhurried pace that he'd used when he'd stood on the road in the pre-dawn and looked at her property like he was already deciding what to do with it. The man with the tobacco chew looked back once at the barn. Just once. Confirming something. May stood in the yard after they were gone and counted her breaths until they steadied. The deed was in the tin behind the flour. She went inside and got it, and spread it on the kitchen table, and read it 3 times in the thin October light coming through the window. Owen's handwriting on the purchase agreement. Walt Dillard's signature on the deed transfer, witnessed and notarized, filed and recorded. She knew what she was reading. She'd read it 100 times. She'd read it the same way she'd read the letter from the land office confirming the filing, a letter she also kept in the tin. The deed was good. Records burned. May folded the deed carefully along its original creases, and put it back in the tin and put the tin behind the flour, and went to the window and looked out at the yard where a man named Court Dillard had just stood and delivered an ultimatum with a smile. She knew what he was. She'd grown up in Ohio near men like him, men who had learned to use the law the way a card sharp uses a deck. The rules were real, the game was fixed, and what looked like a legitimate transaction from a distance was something else entirely up close. She knew he had the money and the patience to tie her up in legal proceedings long enough that it wouldn't matter whether she won. She also knew that the record of her deed existed and was genuine, and that the law, in the long run, was on her side. The long run was the problem. Winter was not a long-run kind of situation. She stood at the window for a long time. She thought about whom she could talk to. She thought about the land office in Sweetwater and the territorial office in Cheyenne. She thought about what it would cost to hire someone who knew the law and whether $41 would be enough for any part of that. She thought about Holt Rannick, who was 4 miles away and had 11 years of operating the largest ranch in the county, and who knew, she suspected, exactly how the informal legal architecture of this part of Wyoming worked. She didn't think about that last thought too long before she put it in its own drawer and shut it. She would handle this herself. She had handled everything herself for 8 months. She would ride into Sweetwater on Monday and sit in the land office and make them show her what they had, and she would go from there. She would not go to Holt Rannick about this, because she was not that kind of woman, and because going to him about this would change something between them that she wasn't ready to examine, and because she had always, her whole life, solved her own problems, and she intended to continue doing that until she had evidence that she could not. The evidence came faster than she expected, but that was for later. For now she stood at the window in the early October afternoon and looked at the wagon track where the dust of Court Dillard's departure was still settling, and she thought, 30 days. She had 30 days and a good deed, and the stubbornness of a woman who had survived 8 months of this country alone. She had survived worse odds with less. She had also, she thought, forgotten what her own laugh sounded like until 4 days ago, and a man with rye straw in his hair had sat on the floor of her kitchen and held her hand and looked at her like she was something he hadn't expected to find still existing in the world. She put that in its drawer. She shut it firmly. She went to make supper. The wind came up hard that night and found every crack in the soddy walls it knew, and May lay in her bunk and listened to it work, and thought about records burning, and thought about 30 days, and thought about a roan horse standing at the end of a wagon track in the grey light of morning, and she thought about what kind of man looks at someone else's property like that before he's said a word to the person who lives there. She thought about Holt Rannick's hands on the grey horse's neck. She thought about the woodpile, which was now adequate, which was something. She fell asleep eventually and dreamed about Ohio, which she hadn't done in months, and in the dream her mother was there, sensible and warm and certain, and her mother said something. May couldn't quite hear when she woke, something practical and clear, the kind of thing her mother always said, that lived in the gap between what a person wished were true and what they actually had to work with. May lay in the dark and listened to the wind and thought, I will ride to Sweetwater on Monday. I will look at what there is to look at. I will figure out what needs to be figured out. And she would. She would do all of that, and it would not be enough. And something worse would happen before something better did. And she didn't know any of that yet. She only knew the wind and the dark and the small sufficient comfort of a woodpile that would last until March if she was careful. She was always careful. Outside in the barn, Solomon shifted in his stall and settled and was quiet. Monday came the way hard things come, without ceremony. Just there when she opened her eyes, grey light at the window, and the sound of wind that hadn't stopped since Friday, and the immediate return of every thought she'd put aside the night before, lined up at the front of her mind like they'd been waiting in the dark for her to wake up. She dressed in the cold. Wool skirt, dark blue, the one that didn't show road dust as badly as the others, her riding jacket with the patched elbows, her tall riding boots, lace tight. She braided her hair properly this time, pinned it, found the bonnet, and put it on, because Sweetwater was a town, and she represented herself in town the way she represented herself everywhere, without apology and without carelessness. She made a fire, she made coffee. She drank it standing at the window and looked at the wagon track in the early light and thought about what she knew. The deed was good. This was the foundation. Owen had been meticulous about exactly one thing during his time on this land, and that one thing was the legal documentation of their claim to it. And he had done it correctly, with a notary and witnesses and a proper filing at the Sweetwater Land Office. In the spring of 1879, she had the original. The Land Office had the record. Those two things existed independently of each other, which was the point, which was why Owen had insisted on the filing, and why she had kept the original behind the flour, in a tin that she had never once in 8 months left the house without checking on. Court Dillard had said, records are imperfect things. He had smiled when he said it. She saddled Biscuit and rode. The road into Sweetwater was 14 miles of wagon track and hardpan, and 2 creek crossings that were manageable in October, but would be a different proposition come spring. She knew every foot of it. She had ridden it twice a month since February, for supplies and post and the specific practical comfort of being among people, even when those people had nothing particular to offer her. Sweetwater was not a large town. It had a general store, a land office, a doctor's office, a hardware supplier, a saloon that she had no business in, a church she attended irregularly, a post office attached to the general store, and a population of 300 and something that expanded and contracted with the seasons. She tied Biscuit at the rail outside the land office at 9:30 in the morning and went in. The office smelled like ink and paper and the particular mustiness of records that don't get enough air. There was a counter and behind it a desk, and behind the desk a man she didn't recognize, small. Young enough that his beard was still working out what it intended to be. He had ink on the cuffs of his shirt and the expression of someone who has recently been given responsibility he wasn't entirely sure he wanted. Where was Mr. Hennessy? He cleared his throat. Mr. Hennessy had taken a position in Laramie, he said. 3 weeks ago. He was the new clerk. His name was Pruitt. He was pleased to assist her. May looked at him for a moment. Then she told him what she needed, verification of a recorded deed, The Callaway Quarter section filed in 1879. Original claimant Owen Callaway. Property purchased from a Walter Dillard. She needed to confirm the record was intact, and she needed, if possible, a certified copy of that record. Pruitt went to the files. He was in the files for a while, longer than should have been necessary for a straightforward record search. May stood at the counter and listened to the sound of drawers opening and closing, and the occasional creak of the floor when he moved, and the wind against the office window, and her own breathing, which she was keeping deliberately slow because she had learned 8 months ago that the only reliable thing she could control was how she breathed. Pruitt came back. He stood behind the counter, and he looked at the counter rather than at her, and he said that the Sweetwater Land Office records for 1879 had been transferred to the Territorial Records Office in Cheyenne, a procedural consolidation. Standard practice for records of a certain age. May looked at him, he looked at the counter. When was this transfer made? Her voice was level. He couldn't say precisely. Some weeks ago. It had been in process before his arrival. Who authorized it? His predecessor, he believed, Mr. Hennessy. Is there a transfer log? A receipt? Something that documents what was sent, and when he would have to look. He thought there might be something. He would have to look. She waited for another 20 minutes while he looked. What he produced was a single sheet of paper, a handwritten list of file ranges transferred, authorized by a signature she could barely read. No date, no receiving office confirmation, no seal. A list on a piece of paper. That was all. May picked it up and read it and set it back on the counter. This isn't a proper transfer document. I'm afraid I can't speak to the procedures of my predecessor. Still looking at the counter. Can you confirm that the records are in Cheyenne? I believe so. Can you contact the Cheyenne office to confirm and request a certified copy? That would take some weeks. May looked at Pruitt for a long time. He did not look up. He had the posture of a man who had been told something and told to repeat it, and had learned that the safest possible position in any situation involving the thing he had been told was to make himself as small as possible and wait for it to be over. She said thank you and left. She stood on the wood sidewalk outside the land office in the October wind with her bonnet pulling at its strings and thought about 3 weeks. Thought about 30 days. Thought about the arithmetic of those two numbers against each other. She thought about Mr. Hennessy, who had worked that land office for 11 years according to what she knew of local history, taking a position in Laramie 3 weeks ago, which was approximately when Court Dillard would have arrived back in Wyoming from Kansas. She thought about records are imperfect things, spoken with a smile. She untied Biscuit and mounted and rode home. The 14 miles back felt longer than the 14 miles there. The wind was in her face on the return, and Biscuit put her ears back against it and set her jaw in the way of a horse, who is not pleased with the weather but intends to continue regardless, which May found she respected. She sat deep in the saddle and let the cold work on her face, and thought without stopping for the full 2 hours of the ride. What she knew, the record was gone from Sweetwater. Possibly in Cheyenne. Possibly not. An unsigned transfer document and a new clerk who would not look at her. What she had, the original deed. Owen's handwriting. 3 witnesses. A notary stamp. What she needed, someone to confirm what was in Cheyenne. Someone who could do it faster than Pruitt's estimate of some weeks. And someone who understood how the law moved in this territory, which was not fast, and not always in the direction that justice pointed. She put the drawer open, the one she'd been keeping shut. She looked at what was in it, then she shut it again. Not yet. She would try one more way first. She had 2 contacts who might help. There was a lawyer in Rawlins named Driscoll, who had done the paperwork on Owen's estate, and who had seemed competent enough in the limited way she'd needed him to be competent. And there was Doc Briggs in Sweetwater, who had been practicing medicine in this county for 20 years, and who knew, as a consequence, approximately everything about everybody, including which judges were reliable and which weren't, and who owned what in the legal and social architecture of the county. She went to Doc Briggs first. Not that day, it was late by the time she got home, and she had animals to see to, and a fire to build, and supper to make, and the ordinary necessary work of being alive. But the following morning she rode back into Sweetwater and knocked on the door of the small clapboard office behind the church. Doc Briggs was a tall, thin man of about 60 with white hair and the careful, measured manner of someone who has spent decades delivering news of all kinds and has learned that the manner in which news is delivered is itself a form of medicine. He listened to her without interruption, which she appreciated, and he made a small sound at the mention of Court Dillard and a smaller one at the mention of Hennessy, and when she was done, he was quiet for a moment. Court Dillard has been back in the county for just under a month, he said. He came through here a week before he came to see you, from what I can gather. Talked to several people. I don't know all of them. He talked to Hennessy. That seems likely. Hennessy took a position in Laramie. That also seems likely, given what you've told me. May looked at him. What do you know about the Territorial Records Office in Cheyenne? Is there someone there who can confirm whether my filing was received? Doc Briggs considered this. He knew a clerk there, he said. A reliable man. He would write a letter today and send it on the eastbound stage. The reply would take 10 days at minimum, more likely 2 weeks. 2 weeks. She had 30 days from Dillard's visit, which made it now 23. 2 weeks for a reply left her 11 days. 11 days was not nothing, but it was not comfortable. Is there anything faster? She asked. The only faster option was someone going to Cheyenne in person. He did not have to say the rest of it. She could see it in the careful way he was watching her. The only person in this county with the standing and the resources to walk into the Cheyenne Territorial Office and get a response the same day was the man whose name occupied the drawer she'd been keeping shut. Thank you, Doc. She stood. She put on her bonnet and tied the strings and was halfway to the door before something made her stop. She turned back. If someone wanted to make a filing disappear, she said, not destroy it, just remove it from where it's supposed to be. Is that complicated? Doc Briggs looked at her. He had the expression of a man who has been a doctor long enough to have also, in effect, been a lawyer and a confessor and an accountant and a judge. It requires someone with access, he said, and someone with a reason to look the other way. Hennessy had access for 11 years. She nodded. She said thank you again and went out into the October morning. She rode home. She fed Solomon. She checked on Biscuit. She went inside and stood in the kitchen for a moment, looking at the flour sack behind which the tin sat with the deed in it. Then she went to the window and looked out at nothing in particular. Holt Rannick came on Thursday. She hadn't asked him to. She hadn't sent word. He simply arrived in the late afternoon on the black horse, the way he'd been arriving, unhurried and without announcement, and she was in the kitchen when she heard the hoofbeats and felt, before she'd consciously processed the sound, the particular quality of stillness in her chest that she had given up pretending was not associated with him. She opened the door. He was tying the black horse at the fence rail, and he looked up when the door opened and their eyes met across the yard, and he said nothing, and neither did she for a moment. Come in. She stepped back from the door. He came in. He took his hat off when he came through the door and set it on the table, which was not something he'd done the last 2 times, and he looked around the kitchen the way a person looks around a room they are beginning to know, cataloging what's familiar and what's changed. The cedar box she kept for herbs was on the windowsill. The coffee pot was on the stove. The flour sack was where it always was. You went to Sweetwater, he said. May looked at him. How do you know that? Raleigh at the hardware store. His wife mentioned you were in town Monday. A pause. I wasn't asking around. It came up. She decided to believe this. I went to the land office and the record isn't there. She said it flat, the way she had come to say things that were hard, without decoration. A clerk named Hennessy transferred the records to Cheyenne several weeks ago. Hennessy is now in Laramie. The new clerk couldn't tell me much. Doc Briggs has written to a contact in Cheyenne. Holt Rannick sat down at the table. This was new. He had stood before or sat on the bench outside, but he hadn't sat at her kitchen table, and the table was small enough that when he sat at it, the room recalibrated around him, the space that had felt adequate suddenly aware of itself. Tell me about Dillard. His voice was level, not asking for her assessment of the situation, asking for facts so he could form his own. She told him. All of it. The man on the roan horse the morning she went for Solomon. The 2 men he brought. The way one of them had studied the barn, what Dillard had said and how he'd smiled when he said it. 30 days. Records are imperfect things. When she was done, Holt was quiet. His hands were on the table, flat, still. She had noticed before that his hands were rarely still when he was working, always doing something useful and specific. But when he was thinking, he went completely motionless, like a very large animal that has decided the best approach to a situation is to stop and let it become clear. I know Dillard, he said. May waited. He's been running debts in Laramie for 3 years. Card games, mostly. The kind of men who run card games in Laramie are not the kind who offer payment plans. He looked at his hands. He needs something with title and value that he can put in front of a creditor. Your quarter section is the nearest parcel he has any legal argument for, however thin that argument actually is. How thin? Thin enough that if your record is intact in Cheyenne, he has nothing. He needs the record to be not there, or to be in question, before he can get a judge to look at his claim. He may have already arranged for it to not be there. Holt looked at her. That's a specific accusation, I know. Another silence. He held her gaze and she held his, and the wind moved outside, and the fire in the stove made its small sounds, and Solomon, audible through the wall, when the wind dropped, shifted and stamped. You didn't tell me about this when it started. He said it without accusation, just noting a fact and leaving room for the explanation. No. Why? May looked at the flour sack, then back at him. Because I have spent 8 months managing everything on my own. Because asking for help is not something I've had occasion to practice recently, and because. She stopped. Because. She met his eyes. Because asking you for this would change what is between us. And I wasn't ready for that to change. He looked at her for a long moment. The expression on his face was one she was beginning to read, which was a thing that had happened slowly. And without her full cooperation, the slight tension around his eyes that meant he was processing something with more weight than his face was showing. Is that still true? He asked. That you're not ready. May thought about 23 days. She thought about Doc Briggs' letter and 2 weeks for a response, and 11 days left after that. She thought about the man on the roan horse looking at her barn like it was already his. I'm trying the legal route first, she said. I want to try it myself. If it doesn't work, you'll tell me. Yes. He nodded. He didn't argue. He didn't offer the obvious counter-argument, which was that waiting 2 weeks for a letter was a luxury she might not have. He accepted her answer and moved on, which she found she was genuinely grateful for, the way you're grateful for a door that opens the direction you expect. All right, he said. Tell me if anything changes. I will. He stayed for supper. She didn't ask him, and he didn't ask if he could. It simply happened, the same way a number of things between them had simply happened, through some mutual unspoken agreement that asking wasn't necessary. She made stew with the last of the elk Reed Kell had brought with the beef delivery, potatoes from the garden, carrots, a handful of dried sage, cornbread. He ate with the focused appreciation of a man who had not had a meal cooked for him by someone who wanted to cook it in a long time. I haven't eaten like this since my mother passed. He said it to the bowl rather than to her, quiet, not fishing for anything. Just true. May looked at him across the table, the lamp between them. His face in the light of it, the lines at the corners of his eyes, and the gray at his temples and the mouth that was doing something that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. Come back Tuesday, she said. He looked up. I will. He rode home in the dark, and she cleaned up the supper things and sat by the fire for a while and did not put any of it in a drawer. He came back Tuesday. He came back Thursday. He came back the following Sunday when the first real frost arrived overnight and turned the ground iron hard and put a skin of ice on the water barrel that May broke with the heel of her boot at 6 in the morning and then stood looking at as evidence that October had stopped, pretending it was going to hold off. The Sunday visit he arrived with a box on his saddle, small, tied behind the cantle with leather cord. She saw it when he came through the gate and felt the particular, internal stillness of someone receiving something they weren't prepared to receive. He untied it and brought it inside and set it on the table, and she looked at it, about the length of her forearm. Grained wood, deep reddish-brown, fitted lid. She lifted the lid. The inside was smooth, sanded down to the grain, and smelled faintly of cedar. that clean, dry smell that keeps moths away and memories in. 2 small brass hinges on the back, a carved edge around the lid frame, not elaborate, a simple doubled line, the kind of detail that takes time and patience and a steady hand. For your herbs. His voice was even. The tin's rust. May ran her thumb along the carved edge. Did you make this? Yes. She looked up at him. He was standing by the window with his hat in his hands, the way he stood when he was giving a room space, making himself take up less of it than he actually did. The afternoon light came in at an angle and showed her the side of his face, the angle of his jaw, the careful, neutral expression of a man waiting to see what the thing he has done means to someone else. Holt. She said his name because it was his name, because she had not said it enough. When did you make this? Few evenings last week. She stood with the cedar box in her hands and looked at him and thought about few evenings, about the hours that required, about the fact that he had spent those hours in the workshop at Roan Ranch, which she had never seen but could imagine, making this specific thing for her herbs because the tin's rust. She thought about what that meant and what she was going to do with what it meant. Sit down, she said. He sat. She made coffee and set both cups on the table and sat across from him. The cedar box was between them. She was quiet for a moment, organizing herself. I want to tell you something. She wrapped both hands around her cup. You told me about Eleanor last month, and I told you about Owen. But I didn't tell you everything. She paused. I didn't tell you how it felt when it was just me. Not the work of it. The other part. He was watching her, very still. There was a period in March and April when I genuinely did not know how to be a person who existed by herself. I knew how to be Owen's wife. I knew how to be a farmer's wife. I knew how to be somebody's something. I did not know how to be just May. She looked at the coffee. It's not something people warn you about. The paperwork of who you are when the person who helped you define it is gone. Holt's hands on the table moved slightly, not reaching, just adjusting. I figured it out eventually, she said. Necessity is a good teacher. But I want you to understand what this, she gestured between them, a small motion, what this costs me to be here for. Because it's not nothing. I am not a woman who does things that are not nothing without knowing what she's doing. He looked at her for a long time. The lamplight moved. The fire in the stove settled. Eleanor died in January, he said. 11 years ago January. There was fever going through the county and I had cattle to move, and I thought she was young enough and strong enough and He stopped. He started again. I was gone a week. She was sick the last 4 days of it. When I came back she was gone. May didn't say anything. I built Roan Ranch because I didn't know what else to do with myself. He said it the same way she'd said her truth, without ceremony, because things that are simply true don't require ceremony. Every acre I added was a day I didn't have to sit still with it. 10 years I did that, and then a year ago I had 40,000 acres, and I was sitting alone in my kitchen at 6 in the morning and I thought, he pressed his mouth together. I thought, all right, is this it then? May held the cedar box in her lap under the table where he couldn't see she was holding it. And then your mule walked into my drawer, he said. And you climbed down off your horse and put your hand on my gray gelding. And I thought, that's a woman who knows what she's doing. Something moved across his face. Not a smile, the thing that lives under where a smile would be. I was wrong about that, actually. You know what you're doing most of the time. The rest of the time you're too stubborn to stop. May looked at him. That's accurate. I know it's accurate. You're describing yourself. I know that too. She put the cedar box on the table between them. He looked at it. She looked at him looking at it. The afternoon was going, the light dropping, and the fire needed feeding soon, and the animals needed their evening check, and there were 17 things she should have been doing. Instead of sitting at this table, she sat at this table. I'm going to try the legal route first, she said. For the land. I'm going to wait for Doc Briggs' letter and see what Cheyenne says. If it doesn't come back right, I'll tell you. You said that before. I mean it more now. He looked at her. What changed? May thought about it. About how to say it honestly without saying more than she was ready to say. I made a cedar box in my head, she said. About you. And I've been keeping things in it that didn't fit in drawers. And the box is getting full. He was quiet for a moment. Then that is either a very good thing or a very complicated thing. Probably both. He stayed until the light was gone and the stars were out, hard and brilliant in the October sky, and she walked to the gate with him when he went to get his horse, and they stood in this cold starlight for a moment before he mounted. He looked down at her from the black horse, and she looked up at him, and neither of them said anything, which was not the same as there being nothing to say. He rode home. She went back inside and fed the stove and checked the tin behind the flour and washed the coffee cups and put the cedar box on the windowsill where the morning light would hit it. She let herself feel pleased about the cedar box. She allowed that. The rest she kept working on. Doc Briggs's reply from Cheyenne came on a Wednesday, 12 days after she'd first spoken to him, and she read it standing on the walk outside the post office, with her bonnet sideways in the wind and the cold of the paper coming through her wool riding gloves. The Cheyenne Territorial Records Office had received a transfer of Sweetwater Land Records in late September. The receiving clerk noted that the transfer documentation was irregular, unsigned by a supervising authority. No itemized list. The records themselves appeared to be intact. A clerk named Calloway, deed transfer 1,879, was in the files. The record was there, and it had been transferred without proper authorization. May folded the letter and put it in her jacket pocket, and thought about what that meant. It meant the record existed, which was good. It meant someone had moved it without following procedure, which was very specifically not an accident, and which gave her something to work with. She needed someone to request a certified copy from Cheyenne, someone with standing, someone who would be taken seriously when they walked through that office door. She stood on the wooden sidewalk in Sweetwater, with the wind at her bonnet strings, and thought about what standing meant in this part of the territory. About 40,000 acres and 11 years, and a man whose word, they said, was the only law that mattered between here and the territorial line. She put her hand in her pocket and felt the letter. She rode home, she fed the animals, she made supper and ate it alone, and washed the dishes and sat by the fire and read Doc Briggs's letter twice more. Then she went to bed. She didn't sleep well, not because she was afraid. Fear was a thing she had made a kind of working peace with over the past 8 months, the low-grade kind that lived in the corners and could be managed by keeping busy. This was different. This was the specific insomnia of a person standing at a threshold, aware that stepping through it will be irreversible, not sure yet whether to call that loss or relief. Holt came on Friday, 2 days after the letter. She had not sent for him. He came through the gate and she was in the yard with a bucket she'd just brought from the well, and they looked at each other across 15 feet of cold October air, and she said, before he'd even dismounted, "There's something I need to tell you." "All right." He got down. She told him about the letter, about the records being in Cheyenne and the improper transfer and the missing supervisor's authorization. He listened without interrupting. He had that quality, she'd noticed, of listening as a complete act rather than a partial one, not organizing his response while she was still talking, just actually receiving what was being said. When she was done, he looked at her and waited. "I need someone who can walk into the Cheyenne office and get a certified copy the same day," she said. "Someone with standing. Not just a request through the post. I know the territorial clerk." His voice was level. "I thought you might. I can ride up Monday." May held the bucket handle. The water was cold against her palm. "This is what I was trying not to ask you," she said. "I want you to know that I tried the other way first. I know you did. And I want to be clear that this is me asking, not me being rescued. There's a difference." He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face, a very small thing, like the last of a frost letting go in the early sun. "There's a difference," he agreed. "And this is you asking." "Yes. Then I'll go Monday." He did not stay long that afternoon. There wasn't need. The thing that needed to be said had been said, and the thing that needed to be arranged had been arranged, and they were both people who understood that not every visit required the full inventory of available hours. He stayed long enough for 1 cup of coffee, and then saddled the black horse and touched the brim of his hat to her on the way out the gate. Monday, he rode to Cheyenne. She knew he was going and knew approximately the distance and the time, and she went about her week with the steady, deliberate focus of a woman who had learned that the only productive response to waiting was to fill the waiting with work. She repaired the hinges on the south pasture gate. She inventoried the cellar and made a list of what she still needed before winter closed in. She cleaned the soddy from front to back and rebanked the base of the walls against the coming cold, packing new sod against the foundation where the frost heave had opened gaps. She checked the tin behind the flour every morning. She did not know what to do with the part of her that was waiting for Holt's return in the same way it was waiting for anything practical. She dealt with it the same way she dealt with the cedar box situation, by acknowledging it existed and then going back to work. Reed Kell came on Wednesday with a new wheel, spoke for the wagon, and replaced it himself while May was in the kitchen garden, pulling the last of the root vegetables before the hard freeze. He worked efficiently and without comment, and when he was done, he came to the edge of the garden and looked at her. "Boss'll be back Thursday," he said. "Thank you, Reed." He nodded. He had started calling her May some weeks ago, without announcing the change, and she had not corrected it. He went to the records office. "First thing Tuesday morning," Reed continued. "He knows the clerk there, man named Aldrich. Was there when they opened." May straightened up from the carrots with a handful of them and looked at Reed Kell. He had the expression of a man who considers loyalty a complete philosophy of life. "Is there news?" "He'll tell you himself." A pause. The careful eyes looking at her with something she had come to understand was his particular version of warmth, compressed and practical, and completely genuine. "It's good news, May," she breathed. "All right. He'll tell you Thursday." He did. Holt came Thursday in the late morning, which was earlier than he usually came, which meant he hadn't waited for afternoon because he had something to say. May saw the black horse on the wagon track from the kitchen window and put the coffee on before he reached the gate. He came in. Hat off, he sat at the table and she put coffee in front of him and sat across from him, and he pulled a folded document from his inside jacket pocket and placed it on the table between them. She opened it. Certified copy. Territorial Records Office seal. Callaway O. and Callaway, M. Quarter section. Filed March 1879. Signed and witnessed and stamped and recorded and real. In her hands. Completely real. She held it and read it again. Aldrich confirmed the transfer from Sweetwater was irregular, Holt said. Missing the senior clerk's signature, which is required under territorial statute for any transfer of records. He's notified the Sweetwater office that the transfer was procedurally invalid and that he's filing a report with the territorial marshal's office regarding the conduct of the former clerk. May put the document down on the table, flat, her hands on it. Hennessy. Her voice was steady. Aldrich didn't say, "But the timing is what it is." She nodded. She left her hands on the certified copy because the paper was real and solid and hers, and she needed to feel that for a moment without talking. "Court Dillard has no legal footing," Holt said. "Not with this document. Not with the territorial office aware of what happened. His claim rests entirely on the Sweetwater record being unavailable, and it isn't unavailable anymore." May looked up at him. He was watching her with the careful attention he gave to things that mattered, the full focus of it, not performing concern but actually paying attention. He had ridden to Cheyenne and back, a day each way, to stand in a records office and get this paper, and he had done it because she asked, and because she had asked was different from, because she needed him to, and he understood the difference, and she understood that he understood it. "Thank you," she said. "You're welcome." She looked at the certified copy. She looked at him. She thought about what she was going to say and decided she was going to say it. "I have not been in the habit of trusting people easily." She kept her eyes on his. "Not since February. Maybe not before February either. I was always more careful than most." A pause. "You have made it difficult to maintain that habit." Holt looked at her, not moving, not filling the space with anything. "I'm not sure whether to thank you for that or not," she added. The corner of his mouth moved, an almost smile, the genuine article, in the one corner that gave it away before the rest of his face decided whether to participate. "You don't have to decide now, I know. But I thought you should know it was happening." He picked up his coffee cup. "I thought you should know the same thing." He drank. Set the cup down. Looked out the window at nothing in particular. 11 years of not trusting anyone with anything that mattered. And then you walked into a dry wash with your hand flat and started singing hymns at my stallion, and I thought, well, there goes that. May sat across from him in the kitchen that was not large enough for both of them, without them being aware of each other, with the certified copy of her deed between them and the cedar box on the windowsill, and the coffee getting cold in her cup, and she thought, there it is. The thing she'd been putting in drawers and boxes. The thing she'd been keeping careful company with from a careful distance. Here it was in the open air. She let it be in the open air. Stay for supper, she said. His mouth completed the smile. Both corners. I will. She didn't know yet what was coming. She didn't know about the Wednesday night 3 weeks from now when she would wake to the smell of smoke. She didn't know about Court Dillard's escalation, the kind that happens when a man who needs something discovers that the legal route has been closed to him and decides to try a different kind of pressure. She didn't know that 4 men were capable of arriving in a yard with fake documentation and a willingness to enforce it, or that someone could walk into a barn at night and hurt an animal to make a point. She didn't know any of that yet. What she knew was the certified copy under her hands, the cedar box on the windowsill, the man across the table who had gone to Cheyenne and back without being asked twice, the way November was coming through the kitchen window in the low slant of the afternoon light, long shadows, the season settling in. She knew she had let something out of a drawer that was not going back in. She knew she was not sorry. She got up and started supper, and Solomon's voice came through the barn wall. One long opinionated sound directed at nothing in particular, and Holt turned his head toward it with the nearest thing to a full smile she'd seen from him yet, and the fire in the stove made its sounds, and the afternoon finished its business, and the night came down over the prairie the way Wyoming nights came, total and committed, stars wall to wall. Everything that needed to be said already said or still waiting in the appropriate place until a person was ready to say it. She was getting there. Not yet, but getting there. 3 weeks after Holt brought the certified copy home, May woke to smoke, not the good smoke. Not the banked fire smell of the stove doing its overnight work, the familiar low scent that meant warmth and morning, and the ordinary machinery of her life. This was the sharp, alive smell of something burning that shouldn't be burning. Outside. Close. She was out of bed before she was fully awake, feet on the cold floor, hand finding the door latch by memory. The night air hit her like a wall of cold, and then the light hit her. Orange, jumping. The stack of cured hay on the south side of the barn was burning in 3 places at once. Not 1. 3. Which was not how hay caught fire from a stray ember or a knocked lantern. Which was not how accidents happened. And there was no wind tonight. No lightning. Just 3 separate points of orange light eating into the stack she had built through September, the feed that was supposed to carry Biscuit and Solomon to spring. She ran. The well was 40 feet from the barn, and she did not stop to put on her boots. The ground in November was iron hard, and she felt every foot of it through her wool stockings, and she did not stop. She pulled the bucket up and ran with it sloshing against her wool nightgown, and threw it on the nearest point of fire and went back. And again, and again. 8 trips. 10. The cold was in her lungs like something solid, and her arms were shaking by the 5th trip, and the fire at the leftmost point kept finding new purchase every time she got the middle one beaten back. Solomon was making noise in the barn. Not panic. Loud. The specific sustained sound of an animal who has assessed a situation as unacceptable and intends to register this opinion at volume until something changes. 14 trips from well to fire. 15. The barn wall was not burning yet. Not yet. The haystack was half gone. The top and the right side, ash and charcoal, and the orange working its way down. And she hit the base of the left point with the last of the bucket, and stood back, vent and watched and breathed, and the fire did not find new ground. Done. She stood in the yard in the November dark in her nightgown and wool stockings with the bucket handle in her hands and looked at what was left of the haystack. Half. Maybe a little more than half if she was being optimistic about the bottom layers. Not enough. She had calculated that stack down to the bale, and she knew what not enough meant for Biscuit and Solomon between now and April. She looked at the 3 places where the fire had started. Separate. Clear. Deliberate. She went inside and sat at the kitchen table and did not do anything for a while. Her hands were not shaking anymore. They had crossed back through shaking into a steadiness that was the other side of it. The flat calm of a person who has used up all their immediate alarm and arrived somewhere quieter and harder. She thought about Court Dillard. She thought about the certified copy in the tin behind the flower. She thought about the territorial marshal's office being notified about the improper transfer, and what that meant for Dillard's legal options, which was, they were gone. The legitimate route was gone. Whatever he was going to do now, it was not going to happen through a courtroom. Which meant 3 separate points of fire in the November dark. She got up and put the coffee on and went out to check Solomon and Biscuit. Biscuit was fine, pressed against the far wall of her stall with her ears back, reading the situation correctly and making no scenes about it. Solomon was still making noise, a steady commentating sound, walking the length of his stall and back. May put her hand on his neck and stood with him until his noise dropped to a grumble and then to silence. She checked the barn wall nearest the haystack. The wood was warm on the outside, not hot. She ran her hand along the boards and looked at the cedar smell of new burning in the air, and was grateful for the small distance between warm and hot and what that distance had cost her in buckets. When Holt came on Friday, she had already done the arithmetic 3 ways and arrived at the same answer each time. He knew something was wrong before she said anything. He came through the gate and saw the ruin of the haystack, and his eyes went to it, and then to her, and she watched the calculation run across his face, the one he never performed out loud, but that she had learned to read in the slight tightening of his jaw. When? He said it flat. Wednesday night, how bad? Lost more than half. He looked at the stack, at the 3 distinct blackened areas along its base. He looked at them for a long moment, and then he looked at her, and she could see him making the same determination she had made in the middle of that night, standing in the dark with a bucket and the evidence. Did you see anyone? No. I was asleep when it started. Tracks? She had looked Thursday morning. The ground was too hard. Frost had set in solid, and anything a horse or a man might have left had been erased by it. Nothing I could read. He was quiet. The kind of quiet that had substance to it, that was not absence but presence. The sound of a man making a decision about how much of what he was feeling was going to be visible. This changes what we're dealing with, he said. I know. He's past the legal argument. He moved past it when he realized Cheyenne had the record and it was intact. I know that too. Holt looked at her. You should have sent for me Wednesday. I put the fire out, May. I put it out, she said. I handled it. I am telling you now because it is relevant, and because you asked me to tell you if anything changed. It changed. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. Neither of them moved. You are the most difficult woman I have ever encountered, he said, not angry. Something else. Something that lived in the same neighborhood as respect and exasperation and was trying to decide which one to be. That seems accurate. She held his gaze. Are you going to tell me I should have handled it differently, or are you going to help me figure out what comes next? The exasperation won. Then it didn't. He took his hat off and pressed his fingers against the bridge of his nose for one brief second and put the hat back on. What do you need for the animals to get through to April? 3 cords of hay, 2 of good grass, 1 of the mixed. I'll have Reed bring it by Monday. I'll pay you back in spring when I can sell. You don't? I will pay you back, she said. Not a question. Not flexible. He looked at her. He accepted it. In spring. They went inside and she made coffee, and they sat at the table and she told him the rest of it, the part she'd been turning over since Wednesday. Dillard had spent 3 years in debt in Laramie. He had come back specifically for this land. The legal route was gone. He had exactly 2 options left, intimidation and physical removal. Wednesday night was the first one. The second would be uglier. He'll come with people, she said, and something that looks official. A paper with a seal, even a bad one. Something he can wave at me and say, this is the authority, this makes it real, get out. Holt held his coffee cup. I know a judge in Carbon County who's been selling his signature for the better part of a year. Doc Briggs has been tracking it. If Dillard can get to that judge, he can produce something that looks legally binding to someone who doesn't know the difference. So we need to know the difference before he does it. We need to be ready before he does it. May thought about this, about what ready meant, about what she was willing to ask for and what she was not, and where the line was between those 2 things and whether the line had moved since she had first drawn it. I need you to be there, she said, when he comes. I need you and your men to be there so that whatever paper he waves, he cannot enforce it by the other means. Holt looked at her. I am asking, she said, clearly. I am asking you to come. Something happened in his face. The tightness at his eyes released, small like a line under tension going slack by 1 degree. When he comes, he said, I will be there. 3 days after that conversation, May rode into Sweetwater for supplies and passed the saloon on the main street and saw Court Dillard's roan horse tied at the rail outside. She did not stop. She did her business at the general store and at the hardware, checking the list she'd folded into her jacket pocket, buying what she needed and not looking at what she couldn't afford. And she was tying the last of the flour sacks onto Biscuit's saddle when she heard boots on the wood sidewalk behind her. Mrs. Calloway. Dillard's voice. She finished tying the knot. Then she turned around. He was better dressed than the last time. Deliberately better dressed. The kind of effort that was meant to be read. A newer vest, brushed. His cravat straightened. The practiced smile installed and operational. I heard about your haystack, he said. Terrible thing, a barn fire. These dry autumns. Everything just goes up. He shook his head in a performance of concern so polished. It had probably taken years to develop. I hope you have what you need to get through the season. May looked at him. My offer still stands, he said. A fair price for the property, given its current condition. Generous, I'd say, given the circumstances. You wouldn't need to worry about hay or wood piles or any of it. Your offer was 30 days. Her voice was flat. The 30 days are gone. I'm a reasonable man, the smile. I understand that a woman in your position needs time. I am not in a position, Mr. Dillard. I am on my land. His eyes changed, small shift. The practiced surface of him momentarily showing what was underneath it, which was not a reasonable man, and not a man who intended to be told no indefinitely. That's a matter of legal interpretation, he said. And legal interpretations have a way of changing. Yours already did, May said. The Territorial Marshal's office received a report about the transfer of records from Sweetwater. I imagine you know that. I imagine that's why you're standing on the sidewalk talking to me about barn fires. The smile stayed, but the eyes had made their determination now, and they weren't bothering to hide it. You should be careful, Mrs. Calloway. This is difficult country for a woman alone. She looked at him for one long moment. She thought about Wednesday night, about the buckets and the cold ground, and the 3 separate points of orange in the dark. She thought about what was in the cedar box on her windowsill, and the certified copy in the tin behind the flower, and the man who had gone to Cheyenne and back without being asked twice. I'm not alone, Mr. Dillard, she said. She turned back to Biscuit and checked the saddle cinch and mounted. Good afternoon. She rode home. She was 3 miles out of Sweetwater when she heard hoofbeats behind her on the road. Not 1 horse, 2. She did not look back immediately. She kept Biscuit's pace steady and waited until the hoofbeats were close enough that looking back was the natural thing to do, rather than the reactive thing. 2 men. Not Dillard. She did not recognize either of them. They were riding together, not at her pace but slightly faster, closing distance in the way of riders who are heading somewhere specific, and that somewhere might be the same as where she was going or might not. She made the first creek crossing and they made it behind her. She came up the far bank and they came up after her. Still not at her pace, still closing. There was a crossroads at the 4-mile mark, where the road to Roan Ranch branched north, and her track continued east. If she turned north at the crossroads, she was on Roan Ranch land, and there would be hands within a mile in any direction. She turned north at the crossroads. The 2 men did not follow. She heard them stop behind her, and she did not look back. She rode north for half a mile until she was certain, and then she stopped Biscuit on the high ground and turned and looked at the road below. The 2 men were gone, continued east, most likely, toward her property. She sat on Biscuit on the high ground in the cold November air and thought. They might be heading east for any number of reasons. 2 riders on a road did not constitute a threat, but 2 riders who had been closing distance on her for 3 miles and stopped following the moment she turned north toward Roan Ranch, that was information. That told her something specific about what those 2 riders had been told, and by whom. She turned south, and then east, the long way around, adding a mile to her route but keeping to the higher ground where she could see the track below. When her property came into view from the ridge, she stopped and looked down at it for a long time. Nothing moving in the yard. Barn intact. No horses she didn't recognize at the gate. She rode down. The barn was fine. Solomon was in his stall doing the thing he did when he disapproved of her schedule, which was stand with his back to the door and look at the wall with the energy of a mule, registering a formal complaint. She checked on Biscuit, checked the water, checked the barn boards she'd been watching since the fire. All fine. She went inside and stood in the kitchen and felt the particular exhaustion of sustained vigilance, the kind that doesn't announce itself during but arrives fully assembled afterward. She sat at the table. She put her hands flat on the surface. She thought about the two riders and about Dillard on the sidewalk and about this is difficult country for a woman alone. She was not going to be alone in it much longer. The following Wednesday started the same as every Wednesday. Cold, gray at the edges turning blue. She built the fire and made coffee and went out to feed the animals and was coming back across the yard with the empty grain bucket when she heard a horse coming fast on the wagon track. Not Holt's rhythm. Wrong weight, wrong pace. Reed Kell came over the rise at a pace he did not usually use, which told her something immediately, before she could see his face. When his face came into range, she saw the rest of it. A split at the corner of his mouth. The beginning of a bruise along his left cheekbone, darker at the center, the color and shape of something blunt applied with intention. She walked toward him. He was already pulling up at the gate. Reed. Her voice was steady, steadier than her chest was. He got down. His movements were slightly wrong, the careful compensated movements of a person managing pain without wanting to perform it. "I'm all right," he said. "Before you ask, I wasn't going to ask." She was already looking at the cheekbone, the split lip, assessing. "Come inside." He followed her in. She got the basin and the cloth, and he sat at the table and let her work on the lip without comment, which was a measure of how much it hurt, because Reed Kell was not a man who easily accepted being attended to. "Two men on the Sweetwater Road," he said. "This morning. They knew my name. They knew I work for Rannick. They said..." He stopped while she pressed the cloth to the lip. "They said to tell anyone who might be paying attention that the Calloway property is a private matter, that outside involvement would be noted." May pressed the cloth and held it. "Did they say who sent them?" "No, they didn't need to." She looked at his cheekbone. The bruising was setting in now, dark blue going to purple. Nothing broken, she thought, but she wasn't certain. She pressed carefully along the bone. He didn't flinch, which either meant it wasn't broken or meant Reed Kell's relationship with flinching was a complicated one. "This is going to get worse before it gets any better," she said. "I know it. He knows the legal route is gone. This is the other route." "Yes, ma'am." She stepped back from him and put the cloth in the basin and looked at the wall for a moment. She thought about Holt. She thought about the conversation they'd had about being ready and what ready meant and what she was willing to ask for. What she was willing to ask for had changed. Wednesday night, the fire. The two men on the Sweetwater Road on Saturday. Reed Kell at her kitchen table on Wednesday with a split lip and a bruising cheekbone. Dillard was no longer testing, he was moving. She had the certified copy. She had the legal ground. And Court Dillard had men who were willing to be in a yard with a paper that looked official enough, and 4 horses and the specific implication of force, and a woman alone could be right about the law and still be on the road by sundown. She knew this. She had always known this was the shape of the risk. She had hoped the legal ground would be enough. It was not going to be enough. She dried her hands on her apron. "Go to Roan Ranch," she said. "Tell Holt what happened. Tell him I think Dillard is coming in the next few days, not the next few weeks. Tell him..." She stopped. She found the words that were true without being more than she was ready to say. "Tell him I'm asking." Reed Kell looked at her. The careful eyes, the compressed warmth. He nodded once. "I'll tell him," he went. She fed the stove and washed the basin and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the November yard. The certified copy was in the tin. The tin was behind the flour. Whatever happened next was going to happen on this property. Her property. 160 acres with Owen's name on the original purchase, and her name next to it on the deed, and the grain of it under her feet every morning, and the sky over it every night, and the specific color the light went in October, that she had not seen anywhere else in her life, her property. She was not leaving it. She went out to the barn and sat with Solomon in the late afternoon. He tolerated this the way he tolerated things he found acceptable, with a kind of gruff permission, not looking at her directly, but leaning slightly in her direction. She sat on the hay bale in his stall and let her breathing slow all the way down and thought about what the next few days were going to require of her. Courage was not the right word. She had not lacked for courage. Courage was the thing that got you through when you didn't have another option. What she needed now was something cooler than courage. Steadiness. The quality of a person who has made a choice and knows why they made it and does not require additional convincing. She had made the choice. Not today. Not in a moment of crisis. She had been making it incrementally for 2 months. Every time Holt Rannick came through her gate and she chose not to close it. Every time she put something in the cedar box instead of a drawer. Every time she let herself feel the ordinary, extraordinary thing of being known by someone who had no obligation to know her. She had made the choice. Now she needed to be equal to it. Solomon put his nose against her shoulder and breathed. "I know," she said. "I know you've been right this whole time." He removed his nose. She was clearly not giving him enough credit. Holt came before dark. Not just Holt. Reed Kell beside him, and behind them the beginning of what she understood, as they came down the wagon track, was a considerable number of men. She stood in the barn doorway and watched them come and counted. 8, 12, 15. She stopped counting at 15 because the number was making the yard feel like a different place than it had been an hour ago. Holt rode ahead of the others and got down at the gate and came through and walked to her and stopped and looked at her face in the way he had, of looking at her face when he was checking something specific, taking inventory of the most important variable. "You're all right." "Not a question. I'm all right. Reed told me what he told you." "Yes." He looked at the barn, at the ruined haystack, still visible in the fading light, the charred base and the tarp she'd put over what remained. He looked at the house. He looked at the yard where 16 men on horseback were now waiting with a quiet that was its own kind of noise. "He'll come soon," she said. "I think tomorrow. Maybe the day after." "I think so too." She looked at him. At the size of him in the last of the November afternoon light, the flat-brimmed hat, the duster canvas, the hands that could close around a lead rope or a barn door or a coffee cup with the same careful economy. She thought about the thing she needed to say and then she said it, because she had decided that being equal to things meant saying them directly. "I need you to let me stand in front," she said, "when he comes. Whatever he says and whatever paper he waves, I need to be the one who answers it first." Holt looked at her. "This is my land." Her voice was even. Not asking him to accept this, not requesting his agreement, telling him what was true. "I have had it alone for 8 months, and I will have it beside you after this. But this moment is mine. I need to answer him myself." He was quiet. She waited. "All right," he said. The 2 words that she had come to understand coming from him meant "I have heard you, and I am with you, and I will not be with you in a way that takes your place." She breathed out. "Thank you. Reed says he had 4 men last time he came. He'll have more this time." "He can have as many as he wants," Holt said, and there was something in the level flatness of his voice that was not a boast and not a threat, and was simply the statement of a man who has done this kind of arithmetic for 20 years and knows what the numbers say. He turned and said something to Reed Kell that she couldn't hear, and Reed nodded and moved back to the men, and the business of arranging 16 men in the quiet around a house and a barn in the November dark began with the efficient brevity of people who knew what they were doing. May went inside. She put the coffee on, because there were going to be people awake through this night, and coffee was what she had to offer. She got the certified copy out of the tin and unfolded it and laid it on the table and read it one more time. Then she folded it and put it in her jacket pocket, the inside one, where she could feel it against her ribs. She looked at the cedar box on the windowsill. She looked at the flour sack. She looked at the window and the dark beyond it, and the shapes of mounted men visible at intervals along the fence line, patient and still, waiting for morning. She had asked. He had come. And now morning was coming, and with it whatever Court Dillard had decided he was willing to do to take from her what was hers. She was not afraid. She was afraid. Both things were true, and neither one was going to determine what happened tomorrow. What happened tomorrow was going to be determined by the certified copy against her ribs, and the man outside her door and the 16 men ranged along her fence, and every choice she had made, incrementally and without fully knowing she was making it, since the morning she rode west to find a mule, was quiet in the barn. The fire in the stove made its sounds. The wind off the plain was cold enough to mean business. May Calloway sat at her kitchen table and watched the night and waited for morning. They did not come the next morning. Mace was up before dawn with the fire built and the coffee made and the certified copy still in her inside jacket pocket where she'd put it the night before, and she stood at the window and watched the gray light come up over the prairie, and nothing came with it except the cold and the wind and the ordinary sounds of a November morning. The men along the fence line were shapes in the mist, 16 of them through the night, trading off in pairs. Reed Kell managing the rotation with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that the hard part of waiting is not the danger, but the duration. Holt had slept on her bench outside. She knew this because she had looked out twice in the night, and he had been there both times, sitting with his back against the soddy wall, and his hat pulled down, and the duster canvas wrapped around him against the cold, awake both times, lifting his head when he heard the door. She had not said anything either time. She had looked at him and he had looked at her, and she had gone back inside and put more wood on the fire and sat at the table and waited. Morning came, Dillard did not. By mid-morning Holt came inside for coffee, and they sat at the table, and she could feel the recalibration happening in both of them. The shift from acute readiness to something that had to be sustainable, because sustainable was what the situation required. "He knows we're here," Holt said. Someone told him. May wrapped both hands around her cup. Or he saw. Doesn't matter which. He looked at the window. "He'll wait until he thinks we've relaxed. How long will your men stay?" He looked at her. "As long as it takes." She held his gaze. "That's not a small thing to ask." "You didn't ask," I offered. She looked at her coffee. The distinction mattered to her, and he knew it mattered, and so he had made it precisely and without underscoring it, which was the thing she kept finding about him, that he understood the difference between saying something for effect and saying something because it was accurate. "He'll come within 3 days," she said. "He can't afford to wait longer than that. His creditors in Laramie are not patient men." Holt nodded. He had arrived at the same conclusion. She could see it in the way he wasn't disagreeing. So they waited. The day was cold and clear, and the men outside rotated and fed their horses, and did not complain. And May made 2 large pots of stew in the late afternoon and sent Reed Kell out with them, and a stack of cornbread, and the men ate in the yard, standing up, and she stood in the doorway watching them, and felt something she didn't have an exact word for. Not gratitude, or not only that. Something older. The specific weight of knowing that people had chosen to be present when they didn't have to be, that the choosing was the point. Holt sat on the bench in the evening, and she brought him stew and sat beside him in the cold, and they ate and did not talk much because there wasn't much that needed saying. The stars came out, hard and specific the way November stars were, and the prairie was dark in all directions, and the men at the fence were visible as movement and warmth against the cold. "Tell me about Eleanor," May said. He looked at her, not surprised exactly. More like a man who has been carrying something so long that being asked about it directly is almost a relief. The way lifting a very heavy thing alone for a very long time, and then having someone take the other end of it is a relief, even when you didn't know you needed help, he told her. Not the version he'd told her before, the compressed fact of it, the loss rendered in the minimum necessary words. This version, the one underneath. Eleanor had been practical and unafraid and better with the ranch accounts than he was, and she had laughed easily, which he had taken for granted, which he had not known he was taking for granted, until it was gone, and the absence of it was its own specific kind of silence in the house. He had thought, those first years after, that if he built enough the silence would eventually become ordinary. Fill it up with the sounds of a working ranch, cattle and horses and men, and eventually the empty space at the kitchen table would just be an empty space. It had stayed empty. "I am not replacing her," May said. "I want to be clear about that." Holt looked at her. "I am not a substitute for something you lost." Her voice was even and direct. I am a separate thing. Whatever this is between us is its own thing, and it doesn't owe anything to what came before in either of our lives." He was quiet for a moment. The stars above the prairie were very bright. "I know that," he said. "I have known that since the dry wash. I just needed to say it. I know that too." She looked at the dark prairie. Owen was a good man who bought a dream with everything he had and worked himself to death for it. I loved him. I am not done grieving him. She paused. "And I am also sitting on this bench with you in November, and not wanting to be anywhere else. Both things are true." Holt's hand was on the bench between them, not reaching, just present. She put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and held hers. They sat like that until the cold made staying impractical. And then she went inside and he went back to the bench outside, and the night passed, and Dillard did not come. He came on the second day. Not at 8 in the morning the way he'd come before. Mid-morning, when the light was full and there was no ambiguity about what anyone in the yard could see. He came over the rise at the head of the wagon track, and he had 6 men with him. May counted from the window. 6, plus himself. 7 in total. She put on her jacket. She checked the certified copy in the inside pocket. She tied her bonnet strings and then took the bonnet off, because she was not going to face Court Dillard in a bonnet, and she didn't care what that looked like to anyone. She opened the door and walked out into the November morning. The men along the fence line were already adjusting, not moving toward the gate, not drawing weapons, just becoming more visible, more present, arranging themselves in the way that makes a count obvious to anyone who is counting. Holt was at the gate. He did not come to meet her in the yard. He stayed at the gate, which was where he needed to be, which was exactly the right position. And he looked at her as she came out of the house, and she met his eyes, and something passed between them. 2 people confirming a plan and confirming each other, and then she walked past him and through the gate and stood in the open ground in front of it. Dillard pulled up 20 feet from her. His men pulled up behind him, a loose spread, the arrangement of men who have been told to be visible but not yet to be threatening. He had a document in his hand, folded, official looking, the corner of a seal visible where the fold broke. He looked at May. He looked at the men along the fence line. He looked at Holt standing at the gate, and May watched his calculations happen in real time, the flicker of surprise he hadn't fully planned for, the adjustment of a man who had expected a different ratio. But he didn't leave, because he was in debt and desperate, and the desperate don't leave when surprised, the desperate recalculate, which was exactly what he was doing. He looked at May and he smiled. "Mrs. Calloway, I see you've invited company." May looked at him. She did not perform anything. She did not arrange her face into anything that was not what she actually felt, which was a cold clarity that had been building in her, since the night she ran to the well with empty buckets and back again, that had been hardening like November ground, with every escalation and every hour of waiting, and everything Court Dillard had done and intended to do. "You burned my hay." She said it flat. Not an accusation that needed his confirmation. A fact she was stating in front of witnesses. 3 separate points. Wednesday night 3 weeks ago. He shook his head. "Regretful. A serious allegation, Mrs. Calloway. I was in Laramie that week. You had men." She held his gaze. They left 3 points of fire in a stack that was too wet to catch by accident and too dry to survive their attention. "You did it because the Territorial Marshal's office received a report about your records transfer, and you knew the legal route was finished." He was still smiling. But the smile had shifted quality. The practiced surface of it was still there, installed and running, but the thing underneath it was visible now, the calculation. The assessment of how much of his plan still held given what he was looking at. He unfolded the document. "I have a court order," he said. "Judge Crane, Carbon County, ordering the transfer of the disputed property to the rightful heir of the original claimant, pending review of the fraudulent sale." He held it up. "You have until sundown." May looked at the document. She looked at it long enough that he thought she was reading it and was uncertain and was considering. She was not reading it. She was waiting. She had learned from watching Holt handle difficult things that the pause before speaking is not dead time. It is the moment in which you decide exactly how much of your actual position you are going to show. She reached into her inside jacket pocket and took out the certified copy and unfolded it. The Sweetwater land records were transferred to the territorial office in Cheyenne in late September, she said. Transferred improperly, without the required supervisor's authorization. The territorial clerk in Cheyenne confirmed this and filed a report with the Marsh office regarding the conduct of the former Sweetwater clerk. She held the certified copy where he could see it. This is a certified copy of the original deed filing. Owen Calloway, 1879. Properly executed, properly witnessed, properly notarized, properly filed. The territorial office confirmed its existence and validity 10 days ago. She paused. Judge Crane, Carbon County, resigned his position 6 weeks ago following an investigation into the sale of his official seal. She had learned this from Doc Briggs 3 days ago. She had not mentioned it to Holt yet because she had wanted to say it here, in this yard, to this man, herself. A court order bearing his seal as of last month is not a court order. It is a piece of paper someone paid him to mark. The smile was gone, not replaced by anything that improved on it. The small bright eyes had gone to something flatter and harder, the expression of a man who has run out of the tools he'd planned to use and is now standing in a yard with 6 hired men and nothing left to wave at anyone. One of his men, the one on the far left, shifted his hand toward his rifle stock. Reed Kell's rifle was up before the hand completed its movement. Not fired, present, aimed, and the man's hand stopped where it was. 3 inches from the stock, fingers spread, going nowhere. "Don't," Reed Kell said. Soft, one word, it was enough. Holt stepped through the gate. He walked to May's left side and stopped there, and looked at Dillard from the height he had, which was the height of a man who had spent 20 years in this territory and understood every dimension of what the word standing meant in it. He did not raise his voice. He didn't touch the rifle at his hip. "The Calloway deed is valid and confirmed by the territorial office in Cheyenne," he said. "The improper transfer from the Sweetwater land office is under investigation by the marshal. The judge, whose seal is on that paper you're holding, vacated his position under pressure of misconduct proceedings. You have no legal footing left, Mr. Dillard. Not 1 square inch of it." Dillard looked at him. The roan horse shifted under him. One of the men behind Dillard was looking at the fence line and counting, and the count was not going his way, and he knew it, and his face showed it. "You can ride out now," Holt said. "Or you can wait for the territorial marshal. I sent word to his office 4 days ago. He'll be in Sweetwater by Friday. The choice is yours, but I'd advise you to make it quickly, because the longer you sit on that horse in this yard, the more of what happened in the past month becomes part of what he's going to hear about when he arrives." The roan horse shifted again. Dillard's jaw worked. He looked at May, not at Holt, which she understood was the last assertion of a man who needed to look like he was choosing his target, even when the choice had already been made for him. "This isn't finished," he said. May looked at him. "Steady. Yes, it is," she said. "You just haven't accepted it yet, but you will." He pulled the roan horse's head around. His 6 men turned with him. They rode back up the wagon track at a pace that was too fast to be casual and too controlled to be a rout, the specific speed of men who have been somewhere they no longer wanted to be and are leaving without running. The document with Crane's seal was still in Dillard's hand when he crested the rise. She watched him go. She watched until the wagon track was empty and the sound of the hoofbeats had gone to nothing. Then she breathed out. The yard was very quiet. Holt was standing beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through her jacket and his duster in the cold morning air. She did not step away from that. "He won't come back," Holt said. No. She was certain of this. A man who has played every card he has, and found them all insufficient, does not come back for more of that specific lesson. He goes somewhere else and finds a different mark. He'll go back to Laramie and deal with what he actually owes. Reed Kell walked up from the fence line, rifle lowered and easy in his hand. He looked at May with the compressed warmth she'd come to know. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He turned back to the men along the fence and made a brief gesture, and the sound of the yard began to change. The particular shift of a sustained situation releasing, men settling back into themselves, the specific quiet relief of people who had been ready for something worse and are processing the fact that worse did not arrive. May stood in the yard outside her gate and felt the November cold and felt the certified copy still folded in her inside pocket against her ribs, and felt the specific weight of what the last 3 weeks had cost her in hours and sleep, and the steady consumption of her reserves of equanimity. She felt all of it. Then she felt Holt's hand on her shoulder. Not gripping, just present. The way he was present, which was fully and without performance. She put her hand over his. They stood like that while the yard around them slowly resumed being a yard. Later, when the men had gone and Reed Kell had ridden back toward Roan Ranch with the last of them, and the November afternoon was settling into early dark, May and Holt sat at her kitchen table with the remains some between them and the fire in the stove, make its seats sounds in the cedar box on the windowsill, catching the last of the light. She had not expected to feel what she felt now. Not this specific thing. She had expected relief, and she had expected exhaustion, and she had expected the particular flatness that comes after a long, sustained effort is over. She had not expected this, the clear, simple awareness of sitting across a table from someone and not needing anything to be different than it was. She had not felt that in 8 months. She had not let herself notice what it felt like until it was back. Holt was watching her, the way he watched her when he was not trying to manage what she could see, which was directly and without agenda. "There's something I want to say." He said it plainly. "Then say it." He looked at the table for a moment, then at her. "I have spent 11 years making Roan Ranch large enough to fill every hour I had. And it has done that. It fills the hours. It gives me work and purpose and the company of men I respect, and all the things that look from a distance like a full life." He paused. "From a distance." May held his gaze. "The morning I came over that ridge and found you in the drawer with your mule and my 3 horses, I was irritated. I'll be honest about that. I was irritated, because it was a problem I hadn't planned for, and I was tired and the gray was hurt." He looked at her. "And then you turned around." She waited. "And you were not afraid of me," he said, "which people usually are. Or they perform the not being afraid, which is the same as being afraid with more effort. You were not afraid and you were not performing anything. You were just—" He stopped. Started again. "You were just yourself, standing there in someone else's drawer with your mule and a kerchief tied around a horse's neck like you'd been there your whole life, and it was simply what needed to be done." May felt the thing in her chest that had been in the cedar box since the morning he'd made it, the thing she'd been careful with, the thing she'd been learning how to carry without spilling it. "I don't know the polite way to arrive at what I'm trying to say," Holt said. "I've been trying to find it for 6 weeks. You don't need a polite way." Her voice was quiet. "I've never asked you to be polite. I've asked you to be honest." He looked at her. The gray eyes, the November lamp between them. "I love you," he said. "That's the honest version." The fire in the stove made its sounds. The wind came off the plain and found its familiar places in the walls. Solomon, audible through the wall in the warm barn, shifted and settled. May looked at Holt Rannick across the supper things, and the lamp and the cedar box on the windowsill, and everything that had happened in the yard today, and everything that had happened in the 3 months before today, all the way back to a dry wash and a mule with an opinion and a gray horse bleeding in the sand. "I know," she said. "I've known for a while." She paused. "I love you too." That's the honest version of what's been in the cedar box. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face went through several things she couldn't fully name and arrived somewhere she could. The expression of a man who has put down something very heavy and discovered that his hands were shaking from the effort of having held it for so long. He stood up. She stood up. The table was between them, which was an obstacle, and he walked around it without hurry and stood in front of her, and she looked up at him the way she always had to, neck tilted, all his height above her, and she thought, "There is this man and I am here and I have made my choice." He put his hand against the side of her face. His palm was warm and rough against her jaw. She leaned into it. He kissed her. Not the knuckle kiss from the morning on the stool by the fire, which had been gratitude and promise in equal measure. This was different. This was the kind of thing that has waited long enough to know its own weight and does not apologize for it. She put both her hands against his chest and felt the solid reality of him, and he held her face in his hands, and the stove settled behind them, and outside the prairie was cold and dark and enormous in every direction, and inside stayed this, with its grass roof and its patched walls and its tin behind the flour. There was this, the two of them, After a while he stepped back. She let him step back. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, which was simply joy, the unguarded, unmanaged version of it, a large, quiet man full of something that had been absent for a long time, and did not quite know yet how to hold that much of it. "I have something to ask you," he said. "I know you do." She could see it in him. She had seen it building for weeks. "Not tonight." He said it with the consideration of a man who understood that some moments deserved their own space, and did not want to compress them into one another. "Not tonight. I want to ask it right." She looked at him. "All right. But soon." "I know." She held his gaze. "I'll be ready." He put his hat on. He got his duster from the peg by the door. He stood in the doorway, which required him to turn sideways the way it always did, the particular accommodation that small doors demanded from large men. He looked at her from the threshold. "I'll come Sunday," he said. "I'll be here," she said. "And then I'll always be here." He nodded. He went out. She stood in the kitchen and listened to the black horse's hoofbeats on the wagon track, and then up the rise, and then nothing, just the wind and the stove and Solomon doing his nightly commentary through the barn wall. She sat back down at the table. She put her hands flat on it. She looked at the supper things and the cedar box and the lamp that was burning low. She thought about Sunday. She thought about what she would say, because she already knew what he was going to ask, and she had already answered it in the cedar box 6 weeks ago, or before that, or possibly in a dry wash, when she had turned around and looked at a large man on a black horse and decided that whatever came next, she was not going to be afraid of it, because maybe that was when. Maybe that was the specific moment, which would mean Solomon's escape had not been an inconvenience but a delivery system, and the mule had been right all along, which she was not prepared to admit out loud, but privately, just to herself, in the kitchen with the fire dying and the night outside and Sunday coming. Fine, he'd been right. Solomon had been right. The mule had walked into the wind the way he always did, and found exactly the thing that needed finding, and stood there waiting for her to catch up, and she had caught up, and here she was. Here she was. She got up and banked the stove and blew out the lamp and went to the window and looked out at the dark prairie and the stars coming through the breaks in the cloud and the cold light of November on the land, her 160 acres with the certified copy in her inside jacket pocket, and the deed in the tin behind the flower, and the grass over it every morning, and the sky above it every night, still hers. She put her hand flat on the cold glass of the window and felt the draft of Wyoming November through the seal, and thought about Sunday, about the things she would say, about the question she was going to be asked, and the answer she had ready and had been carrying around for a while now, just waiting for the moment it was needed. The land was hers, and so was Sunday, and so was everything after it. She went. Outside in the barn, Solomon made one brief sound of approval, and went to sleep, which May did not hear, but which Solomon absolutely intended. The morning came cold and clear and permanent, the way Wyoming mornings came, and the wagon track was empty, and the fence line was just a fence line again, and Court Dillard was somewhere on the road to Laramie, and the certified copy was in the tin behind the flower, and May Calloway was standing in her yard in the November dawn with the sky going pink in the east, and the prairie silver in every direction, and the specific feeling of someone who has been through something, and come out, side still them something, and come out the other side, still themselves, still herself. She let that be true for a moment before she went to feed the animals. Then she went to feed the animals. Sunday arrived the way Holt Rannick arrived at things, without announcement, without performance, just there, fully committed. When she opened her eyes, May lay still for a moment in the gray pre-dawn, and listened to the ranch house settle around her in the cold. She had been at Roan Ranch for 3 weeks now, since the confrontation in the yard, since the dust of Court Dillard's departure had settled, and the men had ridden home, and Holt had stayed for supper and said what he said, and she had said what she said back. 3 weeks of learning the rhythms of a larger place, the sounds it made at night, the way the wind moved differently through a house built for permanence rather than survival. She dressed in the cold, the dark green wool skirt, the white blouse with the small buttons at the wrist. She had learned in the past weeks that Holt noticed when she dressed with intention, not through any comment. He was not a man who commented on appearances, but through a slight alteration in the quality of his attention. The way a person looks at something they are glad is in the room. She wanted him to notice today. She built the fire in the kitchen stove and put the coffee on and went out to the barn in the dark to feed Solomon and Biscuit, who had been at Rowan Ranch long enough to have established their positions in the social order. Solomon's position being, as always, senior to everyone and everything present. She stood with her hand on Solomon's neck in the warm dark of the barn and breathed with him for a moment. He ate his grain. He was not interested in her emotional state. He was interested in his grain. This was one of the things she liked best about him. She went back inside. She poured coffee. She sat at the table and looked at the cedar box on the windowsill of the kitchen that was 5 times the size of her Sadiq kitchen and had windows on 3 sides. And she thought about what today was going to require of her, which was not courage exactly, but the specific willingness to receive something she had decided she wanted. She heard the black horse on the road before she saw anything. Not checking the window, not adjusting herself. She just sat at the table with her coffee and listened to the familiar weight of his approach coming down from the direction of the main house, where he had stayed last night to give this arrival its proper shape, and she thought, there he is. Right on time, he knocked. 3 times, deliberate. Which was new. He had never knocked at her soddy door. He had simply arrived, and she had heard him coming and opened it, or he had spoken her name from the yard. But today he knocked, and the knocking said, I am treating this as something that deserves a threshold. She opened the door. He was standing on the porch with his hat already in both hands, and the December morning behind him, pale and cold and bright at the edges where the sun was thinking about appearing. He had shaved. His shirt was the good dark flannel, the one without the wear at the collar, and he had done something with his hair that suggested water and a comb had been recently involved. He looked like himself, which was the best thing he could have looked like, and he looked like himself making an effort, which was the other best thing. Come in, she said. He came in. He set his hat on the table. He did not sit down. He stood in the kitchen with the particular awareness of a man who has been rehearsing something and has now arrived at the moment where the rehearsal ends and the real thing begins, and he looked at her and she looked at him, and neither of them spoke for one full breath, because some moments deserve their own weight before words get into them. I have been trying to find the right way to do this since Thursday, he said. You don't need the right way. She kept her voice level. I've never asked you for the right way. I've asked you for the true way. Something settled in him when she said that. She could see it, the slight release of a man who has been holding a precise shape and has been told he can put it down. He looked at the table, then at her. I am 42 years old. I have 40,000 acres and a house that is too large for one person, which I did not consider a problem until I stood in a dry wash and watched you walk toward a horse that had near killed 2 of my men, with your hand flat and your eyes down, and a hymn coming out of you like it was just the obvious next thing to do. He paused, and I thought, there is a woman who knows what she is doing. I was wrong about that in the specific and right about it in the general. You know what you're doing most of the time. The rest of the time you're too decided to stop. May held her coffee cup. I am not easy, he said. I have habits that 11 years of no one to answer to have made considerably worse. I am too quiet for too long, and then I have opinions I've been saving up. And I am afraid of this in a way I have not been afraid of anything since Eleanor died. Because the last time I was responsible for someone I was gone when I should have been present, and I have never fully set that down. He looked at her directly. I am telling you this because the true version includes the parts that don't recommend themselves. May set her coffee cup on the table. She crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him. You are the most careful man I have ever known, she said. Not because you're incapable of failure, because you have paid for carelessness in full and you know the cost of it down to the last cent. People who know that cost are careful in a way that people who don't know cannot manage. She held his gaze. You are not going to be gone when I need you. I know this not because you've promised it, but because of every morning you showed up at my gate when you didn't have to, and every time you let me lead, and every time you asked what I needed instead of deciding what I needed. She paused. I have been watching you for 3 months. I know what I'm looking at. He put his hand against her face, palm warm against her jaw, rough in the way of hands that have worked hard for a long time, and she leaned into it. Marry me, he said. You're already here. You've already made this kitchen yours, and Solomon has already informed the entire herd of his seniority, and Biscuit has found her paddock, and you have put your mother's crock on the high shelf, and your cedar box on my windowsill, and I want the rest of it, the ordinary daily rest of it. Sunday mornings and disagreements, and the long work of knowing someone over time. His thumb moved once against her cheekbone. Marry me, May. She had been ready for this question before she knew she was ready for it. Ready since the cedar box. Ready since some morning in November when she had stood at the kitchen window of her soddy, and understood that what she had been carefully not wanting was exactly what she wanted, specifically, without substitution. Yes, she said. That's the whole answer. Just yes, he breathed out. A long, slow release, the kind that carries the weight of every day you've held something at careful distance and have finally been told you can stop holding it there. He bent down, because he always had to bend toward her, and he kissed her, and it was not brief, and it was not tentative, and it was the kind of thing that has been given enough time to understand its own weight. Outside in the barn, Solomon kicked the wall once, a single authoritative thump. They both pulled back and looked at the barn wall. He approves, May said. He approved before we did. Holt's voice had something in it she didn't hear often, which was uncomplicated lightness. I think he's been managing this since September. Don't tell him that. He'll be impossible. He's already impossible. More impossible. They sat down at the table and drank the coffee and talked about what came next, because they were both people who understood that the practical and the romantical and the romantic were not separate categories, but the same thing at different scales. The quarter section would stay registered in May's name. She had already moved her animals and her kitchen things and her herbs, but the land was hers and would remain hers, recorded separately and clearly, because she was not a woman who dissolved into arrangements, and he was not a man who wanted her to. She knew healing. He knew building. The ranch had needed someone who knew healing for years and hadn't had it. These facts fit together without requiring either of them to be smaller than they were. 6 weeks, she said. He looked at her. I want to be married in the Sweetwater church, properly, with the circuit preacher and whoever wants to come. She met his gaze without apology. I was married properly the first time. I intend to be married properly this time. 6 weeks, he said. No argument, no impatience performed. Just the acceptance of a man who has learned that what May Calloway decides she needs is usually exactly what is needed, and that fighting it costs more than it gains, which was, she thought, precisely why. The 6 weeks were full in the way that purposeful time is full. Each day pointed toward something known and wanted. She moved through the work of the ranch and her own preparations with an energy she recognized from before February, from before the long hard year of managing alone, the specific energy of a person who is building towards something rather than simply sustaining. She had not known she was missing it until it came back. She learned the ranch. Not just its geography, which was large, but its texture, which horses were difficult, in what specific ways, which hands had what knowledge, where the drainage was wrong in the north pasture, where the fence was weakest along the creek. She brought her mother's knowledge to it and found it applied. A horse's infected eye in the 2nd week. A cow with a bad front leg in the 3rd. Reed Kell's shoulder, which had been bothering him for 2 years, and which he had not mentioned to anyone because mentioning it implied asking for help, and asking for help was not something Reed Kell did easily. She mixed a poultice from her stores and told him to apply it twice daily, and he did so with the embarrassed precision of a man following instructions he considers slightly undignified and deeply necessary. His shoulder improved in 10 days. Word moved through the ranch hands the way practical results always move among practical men, without ceremony, as simple evidence. After that she was consulted about things she had not expected to be consulted about, and she found she was useful here in a specific and grounded way, not filling a role but matching a need with knowledge she actually had. Holt watched all of this. She caught him watching sometimes, from across the yard or from the workshop doorway, with the expression she now had full vocabulary for, the settled satisfaction of a man watching something work the way it was supposed to work, without vanity in it, without ownership, just rightness. He built her herb shelves in the 3rd week, not on a Sunday as she'd told him to wait. She had said Sunday. He had waited until the following Saturday, which she decided was close enough. She came into the kitchen and found him already at it, crouched under the east window with the level and the wood, hair dusty from the workshop, shirt sleeves rolled. He had measured 3 times before cutting anything. She could see the marks. She made coffee and did not comment on the Saturday situation. He accepted the coffee without comment on his part either. This was a system that worked. The dress arrived 5 days before the wedding, brought by Reed Kell in brown paper tied with string. The women of the ranch had organized this entirely without her participation, which she had initially found presumptuous and had come to understand was the specific language of welcome that people who do not make speeches choose instead. The fabric was cream wool, fine woven and soft, cut with more skill than she'd expected and fitted, as though someone had paid close attention to her measurements. There was small stitching at the collar and cuffs, not elaborate, but careful. The kind of detail that takes time and the intention to take time. She hung it on the peg by the east window and looked at it in the winter afternoon light. She thought about the women who had cut and stitched it, about Reed Kell carrying it on his saddle, about the way a community absorbs a person sometimes, quietly and through practical acts, before that person has fully registered what is happening. She had been absorbed. She was not sure when, but she had been. The morning of the wedding was the kind of December morning that Wyoming produced occasionally as evidence that it was capable of beauty when it applied itself. Sky the deep specific blue of high altitude in winter. No cloud. The sun low and brilliant. The Wind River peaks white against it. The lower country still and cold and lit from the side so that every fence post and frozen grass stem had its shadow sharp behind it. May stood in the yard before she went in to dress and let herself feel the occasion of it. Not performing feeling, actually feeling it. The bigness of the day. The specific weight of choosing something with your whole self rather than the careful, partial way of someone waiting to see if they were right. She had chosen with her whole self. She was not afraid of being wrong. She dressed carefully. The cream wool dress. Her best boots. Dark leather she had polished the night before. She pinned her hair with twice the usual number of pins, and found the piece of blue ribbon she had been saving, and tied it around the stems of prairie sage she had cut from the south pasture edge, the gray-green smell of it clean and particular to this country, this ground, this life she had built and rebuilt and was now building again. She looked in the small mirror above the washstand. She looked like a woman going to her wedding. She looked like someone who had survived something difficult and come through it still herself, all original parts present, and who considered this, on reflection, the most important thing. She said goodbye to Solomon. She said goodbye to Solomon. He was unimpressed by the dress and made this clear through the quality of his indifference, which was different from his ordinary indifference, in that it had a slightly performative quality. The indifference of an animal who is making a point. I know, she told him. You've been right all along. He turned and looked at his water bucket. She rode Biscuit to Sweetwater. The church was the small white clapboard one at the north end of town, paint going gray at the corners, a bell that rang on Sundays with more enthusiasm than accuracy. May had attended it 7 times in the past year, and knew the smell of its hymnals and the sound its wooden floors made underfoot. She had not anticipated the number of people. The women from Roan Ranch. Reed Kell in a jacket she had never seen before, hair subdued by water and intention. 15 of Holt's men in clean shirts, occupying the pews with the slightly formal discomfort of working men in a building that required sitting still. Doc Briggs in the front row. Mrs. Halverson from the hardware. The young clerk Pruitt, who had come and who caught May's eye when she entered, and gave her a nod she chose to accept as the closest thing to an apology a nervous young clerk in a difficult situation could reasonably offer. And at the front of the church, at the altar where the preacher waited, Holt Rannick. He was wearing a dark charcoal vest over a white shirt with a proper collar. He had shaved. His hat was in both hands already, before she was halfway down the aisle, which she registered as the equivalent, from him, of a very long speech. He had made himself as unarmored as he knew how to be. He was standing straight, which he always did, taking up more of the front of the church than the architecture had anticipated, and he was looking at her with everything visible, all of it. Just out in the open, the weight of 11 years, and what it had cost, and what had come after it, and what he was standing here for now. Reed Kell was beside her. He had offered 2 weeks ago without being asked, and she had said yes because it was right. He offered his arm, and she took it, and they walked the length of the small church together, and she was aware of the people on both sides, but only at the edge of her attention. The center of it was at the front. Reed placed her hand in Holt's and stepped back. Holt's hand closed around hers. She felt the warmth of it, the specific temperature of him that she had noticed early on and continued to notice, as if he generated more heat than the ordinary. The preacher began. She heard the words and meant them. She said them back in her own voice, looking at Holt, who said his in the register he used for things that were completely true, which was quiet and certain and did not require volume to carry weight. When the preacher finished, Holt bent toward her, because he always had to bind her from a distance, and he kissed her, in front of Doc Briggs and Reed Kell and 15 cowboys in clean shirts and everyone else who had come on a cold December morning to see it, and he was not in any hurry about it. Reed Kell began the applause. After, there was coffee at the church and the specific warmth of people who are glad something has happened gathering to say so. May found herself in a long conversation with Mrs. Halverson about medicinal herbs, and discovered that Mrs. Halverson's mother had been a healer in Indiana, and they had more in common than a commercial relationship, and this was the gift that communities kept giving when you were not expecting it, the way they kept showing you what was in them. Holt was across the room talking to Doc Briggs. She watched them from the corner of her eye. 2 men having an actual conversation, the kind that required both of them to think. She thought, every day I will be with a man who talks to people as if what they know matters. Every day. And she felt the specific quality of that, the way a person feels something they had not known they were missing until it was present. They rode to Roan Ranch in the December afternoon, just the 2 of them, Biscuit beside the black horse. May had ridden toward Roan Ranch many times in the past months, but had always turned back at some point, back to her own land, her own gate. Today she did not turn back. They rode through the Roan Ranch gate, and the ranch spread before her in the winter light, and she looked at it and thought, I can live in this. Not as a resolution or a capitulation, as a simple fact. I can live in this. That night they sat by the kitchen stove and ate supper, and talked about nothing in particular and everything in passing, the way people who have recently decided something permanent talk, with the ease of a decision that has been made and does not need to be made again. The kitchen was warm. The December dark was pressed against the windows. May looked at the cedar box on the shelf above her herbs, and thought about the morning she had first held it, the weight of the wood in her hands, and the smell of it, and the specific understanding that had begun in that moment without her full permission. She reached across the table and put her hand over his, where it rested on the wood. He turned his palm up and held her hand without looking away from her face. They stayed at the table until the stove needed feeding, and then they fed it and stayed some more, and the night did its long work outside, and they let it. Winter deepened. December into January. Cold and clear and brilliant in the way of Wyoming winters when the weather decides on honesty rather than ambiguity. May found the rhythms of the ranch becoming her own rhythms, the early dark and the early light, the specific weight of 40,000 acres, expressing itself in the daily work of keeping it. She wrote to her mother's family in Ohio in January, a real letter longer than she had written in over a year, telling them about the ranch and the wedding and the life she was building. She had not written much during the hard year on the quarter section, not wanting to worry them with a version of herself she was not proud of. Now she had something to report that was true and good, and she found that writing it made it more real in the particular way that things become more real when you describe them to someone who loves you. The reply came in March and made her cry at the kitchen table, which she did not attempt to manage. And Holt came in and found her there and sat down across from her and waited, which was what she needed. Good news or bad? He said. Not a question. He could see it was good. He just wanted to give her the space to say it. My mother's sister is still alive, May said. She is 71 years old and she is apparently still running the farm, and she says she had to start again. She says she has been praying for me every morning since she heard about Owen, and she is glad I have found my feet. Holt looked at her. Have you? May thought about this with the letter in her hands, and the March light through the kitchen windows, and the sound of the ranch going about its business outside. "Yes," she said. "I have found my feet and the ground under them." He nodded. He got up and poured more coffee and set it in front of her and went back out to the work, and she sat with the letter and the coffee and the specific gratitude of a person who has been seen accurately by someone who loves them, which is one of the rarest things in the world and should not be taken casually. April came with the particular tentative commitment of Wyoming springs, cold retreating in stages, the brown going to pale green in fits and starts, the cottonwoods along the creek showing their first leaves with what appeared to be caution, as if they had been caught out before by a late frost and were not willing to commit entirely until they were certain. May was in the kitchen garden one morning in the second week of April, turning the beds she had been rehabilitating since her arrival, when she understood something. Not a thought arriving in order, a physical knowledge, the kind that does not announce itself through the mind but through the body, which has been keeping count on its own. She put down the garden fork. She stood in the April morning with the smell of turned earth around her, and counted carefully, and counted again, and arrived at the same answer both times. She went to the workshop. Holt was at the workbench with a piece of wood in the early stages of becoming something, the rough shape that precedes all shapes. He looked up when she came in, and then he looked at her face, and whatever he saw in it made him set the wood down. "Sit down," she said. He sat on the workbench. She stood in front of him and told him simply, without building toward it, because the thing itself was large enough without architecture around it. He was completely still. Not the controlled stillness he used in difficult situations, the professional stillness of a man managing a room. This was different. This was the stillness of a person who has received something so large that the ordinary machinery of response has temporarily stopped while the system reorganizes around it. Then he put his face in his hands. May crossed the workshop floor and stood behind him and put both hands on his shoulders and felt the shudder move through him, the involuntary one. The kind that comes when something you have stopped hoping for arrives without warning. She did not speak. She kept her hands on his shoulders and waited. After a while he lifted his face. His eyes were wet and he did not try to conceal this, which was one of the things she had learned about him, that he did not perform composure when composure was not what was actually happening. "I thought I had run out of this," he said. His voice was rough at the edges. "I thought that was simply finished. Something that was not going to be part of my life. I know. I am going to be afraid. I know that too." He reached up and covered her hands with his, where they rested on his shoulders, his large hands over hers, and he looked out through the workshop window at the April morning, the pale green of the cottonwoods, the long grass beginning to silver in the wind, the particular blue of a Wyoming sky that has finally decided spring is not a threat. "We'll be afraid together," he said. Because she had said it first in November, and he had held on to it. "Yes," she has said. "That's exactly how we'll do it." He stood and turned and held her, not the formal, careful way of a man unsure of his welcome, but the way of a man who has finally stopped calculating the distance and simply closed it, and she put her hands against his chest and felt the solid fact of him and thought, "This is what I went looking for when I went looking for a mule. Not this specifically. Not this man and this workshop and this April morning, but this quality of thing, this specific weight of not being alone in the world." Solomon knew was the thing. Solomon had known before either of them. He had walked into that wind on a September night with the pure conviction of an animal, following something he could smell from a long way off, and he had stood in that draw with 3 lost horses, and waited for May to arrive and catch up to what he had already figured out, which was, here, this direction. Keep going. She had kept going. Autumn came back around, the second one, and with it the particular light she had come to think of as specifically hers, the low amber angle that made the prairie look like it was lit from inside. May stood at the corral fence in the late afternoon and watched the horses come in from the pasture, the chestnut stallion moving through the golden light with the easy confidence of an animal that has been given sufficient reason to trust the world, his coat shining, his gait clean and even. He had come a long way from the dry wash. So had she. Holt came up from the corrals and stopped beside her at the fence, and they stood in the way they had developed, close, her head at the level of his arm, the particular fit of two people who have learned how to occupy the same space without requiring the other to be smaller. Solomon was. With the horses, he had integrated himself into the Roan Ranch herd with the confidence of a mule who considered this outcome inevitable and was not interested in anyone's surprise about it. He moved through the group with the authority of an animal whose position is self-evident and does not require confirmation. The chestnut stallion was near him. The way the chestnut was often near him, the old companionship of the draw reconstituted in new surroundings. Solomon saw May at the fence. He left the group, slowly, with dignity, at the pace of a mule who is coming over because he has decided to come over and not because anyone has called him. He walked to the fence and stretched his neck over the top rail and breathed against her hair, warm and grass-scented and deeply settled, the breath of an animal who considers the current arrangement entirely satisfactory. She put her hand on his nose. He allowed this. "You took your time getting us here," she told him. Solomon looked at her with one dark eye, the look of a mule who considers the statement directionally incorrect and the record self-evidently clear. He had not taken his time. She had taken her time. He had been waiting in that draw since September, with considerable patience while the humans sorted themselves out, and he considered his role in the proceedings to have been not advisory but decisive, and he would appreciate it if that were acknowledged. May scratched the bridge of his nose. "All right," she said quietly. "You were right. You've always been right. Is that what you need to hear?" Solomon removed his nose from her hand and looked out at his herd with the expression of a mule who has received adequate acknowledgement and is prepared to move on. Holt's arm came around her shoulders. She leaned into him, into the warmth and the particular solidity of him that she had stopped cataloging and started simply relying on, the way you stop cataloging the ground you walk on at some point and simply walk on it. The sun finished its angle across the prairie. The light went from amber to copper to the thin red line that meant the day was completing its business. The horses moved in the last of it, their shadows long behind them. Inside the ranch house, in the room they had made ready in August, and which was now in use, and which contained a person who had arrived in September, and who had, in the 4 weeks since, established a position of considerable authority within the household, there was a small sound, not distress. The ordinary small sound of someone making an assessment of their surroundings from a horizontal position and finding the surroundings adequate. May heard it through the wall. She pushed off the fence rail. Holt's arm came away from her shoulders. "Go," he said. He was already smiling. The full unguarded version, both corners, the one she saw now most days, and which she intended to keep seeing for as long as she lived. She went. Behind her, Solomon watched her cross the yard toward the ranch house. He watched until the door closed behind her. Then he turned back to the horses with the satisfied expression of a mule who has shepherded a complicated situation to its correct conclusion and considers the matter resolved. Not by anyone else, by him. He had been the decisive factor. This was clear. He went back to the herd. The October stars came out as the dark settled in, hard and brilliant the way they always were at this elevation in this season. The whole wheel of them turning above the prairie that rolled away in every direction without apology for its size. The Roan Ranch sat under them, lit from the inside, a house with people in it, a barn with animals in it, a kitchen with herbs on a shelf, and a cedar box on a windowsill, a workshop with sawdust on the floor, a garden that would be better in the spring for what had been done to it this year, a life. The ordinary, specific, irreplaceable weight of one. May Calloway had ridden west one September morning to find what she had lost. She had found in a dry wash with bad ground and mesquite and a mule who knew something she didn't, what she had not known she was looking for, and it had found her back. And they had been afraid together and glad together, and had built something out of the available materials, which were considerable, which were each other. The wind came off the prairie and moved through the long grass and the cottonwoods along the creek and went on west, the way Wyoming wind always went, not stopping for anything, carrying whatever it carried to wherever it was going. Solomon, in the barn, settled into his stall with the decisiveness of a mule who has had a full day and has earned his rest. He put his nose toward the chestnut stallion's stall and breathed once. The chestnut breathed back. Old companions. The night closed in. The ranch went quiet. The stars turned above it all, indifferent and permanent and exactly right.